Maoist Communist Union, and we're here today to talk about the Donroe Doctrine and Venezuela, U.S. imperialism, and what the hell's going on. Now, this is obviously not January 25th. We're a week later, in case anyone was confused. We got snowed out last week. It's a fairly unprecedented time in the world right now. And really, since Trump's election in 2016, people have sort of been waking up in various ways. And I mean, the masses of people broadly in this country, to the fact that things are pretty fucked up in the world and not normal. But this has rapidly accelerated since COVID. And now with Trump 2.0, we have some fairly major shifts taking place in the US foreign policy, at least in its public articulation, as well as domestic policy, with the deployment of ICE agents basically openly carrying out a trial run of fascism, the White House tweeting out KKK songs, Nazi, open like German Nazi slogans, like not hidden, and so on. And now, as people have probably seen with the release of the latest batch of the Epstein files, it's become broad public knowledge that a large portion of the capitalist class that run this country are coordinating globally with other capitalists to not only like traffic young children, but to kill them, to maybe even eat them and murder them. There's been a lot of discussion that. It's very disturbing. It also lays bare the the kind of practices of the capitalist class, which are a result of their underlying exploiting position in the society overall. Namely that we have a very small number of individuals who run this country and run the other countries in the world who collaborate and compete, sometimes go to war with each other, who subsist on the wealth created by the vast majority of humanity. Marx said the capitalists are vampires. He didn't mean it literally. Now we literally have vampires like Peter Thiel. But this is just an expression of their concrete social position, where they have grasped in their hands the wealth that the vast majority of humanity has created. Us and all of our ancestors. They have it under their control. And they use it to benefit themselves, to enrich themselves, to carry out their deranged games, to compete with each other for more control, and to put us further and further into subjection. I mean, that's the fucked up thing, right? Where does all the money for Palantir's new tech come from? It's not like Thiel's paying a bunch of taxes. No, it's coming from the tax dollars from the American people. It's coming from the exploitation of the people of the world who labor away their lives, often very short lives, either because they're killed or because they're worked to death, so that a very small number of people can be very wealthy. And that's the nature of the capitalist system. And that's also, and I'll just say this briefly before getting to the presentation, why the whole framework of no kings is so absurd. Not only is it funded by the Waltons, who founded Walmart, and Bill Gates, who's obviously on the Epstein list, and George Soros, who's carried out US foreign policy through all sorts of color revolutions around the world. But also, let's be real. Even at the height of the Crusades, no feudal monarch could ever dream of the type of power and social control and horrors that the capitalists are bringing upon the people of the world today. They could never do something as fucked up as they were, and the feudal kings were very fucked up, like what Israel's doing to Palestine right now, where they calculate every single calorie that's going in to Gaza to starve the people out and wear them down. They play sounds of babies crying in the middle of the night, make sure no one can sleep. This is next level stuff. So let's not be fooled by those who claim this is all about resisting monarchy for our great democracy. Yeah, sorry. So I can move it here. Is that better? Okay. So let's not be fooled by the Democratic Party and their related nonprofits and various entities who are funded by and really are part of the capitalist class who seek to contain and corral the various forms of mass outrage and protest aimed to fight against the capitalists and their imperialist designs. And that's something of a preamble given all that's going on in the world today. We're not going to be able to cover the vast majority of that. And even as it concerns the Donroe Doctrine and US foreign policy and the nature of capitalist imperialism, this presentation in just 2 hours or so, I can only cover a small amount of the whole situation. But hopefully it will be enough to outline some of the general threads of what is going on, some of the possible confusions that are ubiquitous right now and actually consciously being promoted by the Trump administration themselves, as well as by other forms of the capitalists, other sections of the capitalists, including the Democrats and a bunch of liberal journalists who are nominally against Trump, but really for the capitalist system and for the American empire. And hopefully this clarification will be sufficient for you all to do further investigation and research, but also to see the importance of a Marxist analysis, both of what's going on in Venezuela and what's going on around the world. And with that being said, I'll just mention one more thing, which is that in the Maoist Communist Union, we run a number of studies. Right now, we're running a study on the betrayal of social democracy, a historic betrayal, but also the contemporary betrayal, which is particularly important given Zoran's election and all the false optimism around him. For those who don't know, his mom's in the Epstein files. She was going to Epstein and Maxwell's parties, amongst other things. And so is Tish's father. He's all in the Epstein files, like a lot. So it's important to understand why and how it was, for example, that the German Social Democrats were the force that led the counter-revolution in 1919 and massacred workers, or how they massacred workers again in Bloody May in 1929 and killed a few hundred workers who were just trying to do a May Day protest. If you know the names Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, you know some of the famous German Marxists, who killed them? The Social Democrats. I'm not saying Zoran's about to go gun down protesters, but I'm saying we're doing this study to understand the false paths that the bourgeoisie puts in front of us that lead to just more capitalism and repression. In the not so distant future, sometime in March, we'll be starting another study. People are free to join. You can join the social democracy study partway through too, on the nature of imperialism abroad and at home. Because we see the ICE agents deploying in the streets of Minneapolis as if they're an occupying army. I mean, in terms of their tactics, but also in terms of their dress, their gear, etc. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it a little bit. Here's our basic agenda. And pardon me, I'm just a little bit under the weather. We have, well, this picture of Maduro. He was captured by Delta Force. For those who don't know what Delta Force is, it's basically the highest level of the Joint Special Operations Command, which is the wing of the military that basically fights all the wars, at least right now. They haven't really fought a big army against army war in a while. And the Special Forces, Delta Force is based out of Fort Bragg. They went in along with the 82nd Airborne, which specializes in night operations, or was 160th Airborne, sorry. And they kidnapped Maduro, seemingly with the collaboration of a large section of the Venezuelan government, and maybe with Maduro's agreement himself. That doesn't mean, and I'll get into this more later on, in the question of Delcy's relationship to the CIA, that doesn't mean this isn't a brazen act of aggression by the US imperialists, but we have to ask ourselves, well, what's the nature of the Maduro government and the Venezuelan government? And here the question of social democracy comes up again. We'll get there, give you a sense of our agenda. I won't go through all these points, but we're going to talk about Iraq. The lessons from Iraq are very important to understand what's happening right now. We're going to talk about the Donroe Doctrine, the battle for South America, the global context in which this is taking place, namely competition with China as a rival imperialist power. We'll learn a little bit of history on Operation Condor, and we'll go through a few other questions. Okay, so the first question that generally comes up with Venezuela and these recent actions, is it all about oil? After all, wasn't Iraq all about oil? So we're told. At the time, unlike now, the Bush administration denied it was all about oil. They said, we're spreading freedom and democracy. We'll be greeted as liberators. You know, shock and awe, and the Iraqi people will be in the streets. And if those who were around, or those who have looked back at the time, if you weren't alive then, or just very young then, there's a ton of puff pieces, New York Times, Washington Post, about how grateful the Iraqi people were. Some concerns about the war, but then like, oh, people are so glad that the US military has come to liberate them. And this narrative quickly fell flat on its face. And of course, then there was a massive insurgency against the US occupation, which at times took on a religious form, but was a massive popular movement against a foreign occupation. And how do you deal with that? Well, the US collaborated with the Saudis and created ISIS. And of course, Mossad was involved in all that too. Okay, we're not going to talk about ISIS so much right now, but isn't Venezuela all about oil? It's not the same, right? I mean, Trump said it's all about oil. He's been going on and on about how it's all about oil. This is different from the Bush administration. Again, they denied it was all about oil, even though the oil companies had partitioned up Iraq. But Trump's saying it's all about oil. He's bragging to the American people about how it's all about oil. And one of his big mega donors, just like Halliburton did in Iraq, is going to get a big chunk of the oil. And then people probably know he set up this offshore fund in Qatar that even Congress has no oversight over. There's kind of unprecedented corruption. He's going to possibly personally enrich himself with this, most likely. After all, his presidency has been fairly open about that. And it's kind of interesting, when Hunter Biden did that, there was very reasonable and correct outrage, and the Trump administration played on that. But it's almost now kind of like people are like, just expect it, like that he's going to make billions of dollars as the president, which on the one hand appears to be indicative of the strength of the Trump administration, but actually is a weakness. To be that blatant and openly corrupt is kind of a violation of the long-standing gentleman's agreement amongst the bourgeoisie, that once you retire from the presidency, like Obama did, you get paid $400,000 to speak at Goldman Sachs and you live very comfortably, but you don't use the office to enrich yourself. But Trump's doing that. So some people say this even proves even more it's all about oil. But let's look at Iraq for a second. Who's the biggest trading partner with Iraq? This is from a couple years ago, their statistics. Is it the US? No, it's China, and secondarily India. But China is the biggest recipient of Iraq's oil. And actually the US, as they retreated from Iraq, Chinese companies took over more and more of Iraq's oil fields. And actually China has a fairly significant sway in Iraq. The other country that has a big sway in Iraq, as people probably know, is Iran. So the whole narrative that the US went into Iraq for oil, they didn't really even secure the oil. Now, the US wanted the oil, but the US corporations couldn't secure it. But the invasion of Iraq was about far more than just oil. It was about projection of US power around the globe. Karl Rove said famously, infamously, he was one of Bush's key advisors and campaign strategists, "We are an empire. When we act, we create our own reality." They believed, and they tried to, and they failed, that they would be easily able to walk into Iraq, dismiss the entire government, set up a client state subservient to the US interest and Israel's interest, and use that to secure long-standing US influence in the entire region. Condoleezza Rice published famously this blueprint for a new Middle East that involved getting rid of Assad, getting rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon, eventually then toppling the government in Iran and establishing a series of pliant US allies in the region. And they failed to do that. Iraq was really about that, about securing the long-term interests of the US empire, of which oil is only one. And especially with the development of fracking and the US being now one of the largest oil producers in the world, they're no longer as dependent on oil imports from the Middle East. But they failed to secure their interest in Iraq, as in Afghanistan. They failed to build pliant client states in both those locations. And if you look at what Trump said about Venezuela, he's quite aware of this. A few weeks ago, he was interviewed, and they said, "Oh, why not go with Machado? She won the Nobel Prize. She's so great. Don't worry about her calls repeatedly for Israel to, basically bomb Venezuela and all that stuff." And then Trump said, "Well, do you remember Iraq? We got rid of everyone, the whole regime, and then we got ISIS. So we don't want to do that." Now, of course, the US created ISIS, and actually the reason the US created ISIS with Israel and the Saudis, and partially Turkey, although there was some competing interest there, was to deal with the growth of popular resistance in Iraq of a genuine character, and also the influence of Iran that was growing in Iraq through the Shia militias. And they don't want a similar sort of quagmire in Venezuela, because it's in the US interest to have a stable situation in Venezuela where they can not only get the oil, but project power, increase the drug trade, which every US client state in South America and Central America is a narco state, and ensure that there's long-term stability for US power projection and influence and investments in the region. And Venezuela, as they see it, is key to that, and is key to countering the influence of Russia and China in particular in South America. Rubio and Lindsey Graham and others made a big stink about Iranian influence in Venezuela, which is pretty minor. But much more concerning for the US state, and we'll get to this in a minute, is Chinese influence in Latin America in particular. And their argument is that really countering Chinese influence in Venezuela and turning it into a US puppet state is the key to controlling South America. We'll come to that in a second. But first, I want to talk about a little bit of how this all shook out. So for those who don't remember, and this story, the New York Times wouldn't let James Risen publish it. This is from 2003. It's written by a reporter, James Risen. He's not the greatest reporter, but he had good intelligence that Saddam Hussein was trying to surrender and say, "Don't invade Iraq. We'll give you everything. We'll give you the oil. We'll give you control of the country. I'll turn over the military to your control. The CIA can come in. You can do whatever you want. And the Cheney, or sorry, I guess technically the Bush administration, the Cheney administration said, no way, we're going for it. The Times wouldn't let this be published until 8 months after the invasion, or 7 months. Why do I raise this? Because Maduro made the same offer. It was reported in the Times before the military action. This is from last December. They said they have offered the Trump administration all the mineral wealth, the oil, and a whole bunch more. And the Trump administration turned it down at that point. Now, there's a lot of speculation on exactly why they did. In my view, I think they basically accepted the terms, but they said Maduro has to go. The charges they've arraigned him on are very bizarre, as people probably know. Great show of hands, who knows what the charges are? It's, being part of this cartel that the CIA created, which was reported by 60 Minutes in 1990, which hasn't existed for a very long time. They dropped that charge. Possession of a machine gun. The head of a foreign country has a gun. And he's all military. What are you talking about? And then one of the charges, illegal mining on indigenous land. So I'm not saying this is definitive, but there's some speculation that basically the charges are going to be dropped against Maduro, or very limited charges will be put against him, especially around maybe election interference in 2020. And that he'll get a soft deal and basically be allowed to either go free or be kept in a minimum security prison. It could be, however, and this is a real possibility, and we'll come to this later, that he was betrayed by Delcy Rodriguez and others in his administration who were more willing to work with the CIA than he was. That's a possibility as well. I mean, Delcy met with Radcliffe, the head of the CIA, in Venezuela, which is absurd and outrageous. And now they've signed over the oil and petrochemical rights. We'll come to that in a second, in a while, but we'll get there. There's these different possibilities that we'll discuss more. Where was Delcy Rodriguez when Maduro was kidnapped? In Moscow. And who was visiting Venezuela the night Maduro was kidnapped? A special diplomatic delegation from China. So there's some evidence to support the thesis. I want to be clear, it's a thesis, it's not proven, that the US basically carried this out and let the two main powers who have influence in Venezuela know, look, we're going to do this in Venezuela. Like, you got to accept it. You can still get some deals, but we're enforcing the Donroe Doctrine. And it's impossible to understand what the US is doing in Venezuela and the maneuvers to try to create a stable client state without understanding the concerns the US ruling class has about Russia, but in particular about China as a global competitor. So let's talk a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine and then the Donroe Doctrine. So historically, the Monroe Doctrine was a policy of the US ruling class that the Western Hemisphere was basically the property of the US, and that no foreign power, especially European power, was welcome to intervene in any meaningful sense in the hemisphere. This was used, for example, by Teddy Roosevelt to justify the Spanish-American War, amongst other things. The Donroe Doctrine is in effect an adapted and modernized version of this. To get a sense of it, well, we have this lovely image, and we had the National Security Strategy that was published last November that covers some of the basics. It's a 25-page or 29-page document, 33 if you count the cover and the back cover and the table of contents, but that was too much and too confusing for Laura Loomer, who thought there was a PSYOP because the page numbers didn't match the actual numbers of PDFs. Just a little side note, but in case you were wondering how stupid she was, that is how stupid she is. Okay, so let's talk the Donroe Doctrine. They say in this document, which they don't call it the Donroe Doctrine in the document, they call it the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. So what they're saying here is basically any foreign power who's not in the Western Hemisphere, who is a competitor to the US. They don't say an enemy, they say a competitor here. And the ruling class in the US is very careful not to say China's an enemy, but they do say China's an adversary now. they say more than competitor. Adversary is an escalation. It's ally, friend, competitor, adversary, enemy. Enemies generally once you're going to war or you're sanctioning the country to hell or something. And any competitor can't position forces or other threatening capabilities. Okay, so no military stuff. For those who don't know, Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary group, for a long time operated in Venezuela. But also, or to control or own strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. What are strategically vital assets? Well, obviously, Venezuela's oil reserves, which are the biggest in the world, although they're heavy sour crude and therefore very hard to refine. You need specialized refineries and the quality is much lower. But also lithium, which is not only in Venezuela, but in Bolivia and elsewhere, rare earth metals, etc. And wouldn't ports or telecommunications infrastructure also be strategically vital assets? They certainly would. And they don't just say own, they also say control, which means various forms and mechanisms of control that the imperialists use beyond just outright ownership, like access to foreign funding. Because, okay, if you're in Venezuela and you want to buy something in the international market, your domestic currency is not worth very much. Most other countries do not want that. You generally have to pay in US dollars. This is true for most oppressed countries. So a mechanism the imperialists use for control is, for example, controlling the US dollar and lending it selectively at differential rates to countries that comply more or less. Another mechanism they use for control is control of intellectual property or control of the parts necessary to run the industry. That's why a lot of the key manufacturing that was kept in the US was the heavy industry that makes things for other heavy industry. So you can have a little factory in another country, but if all your replacement parts can't be made domestically, what happens when things break? You got to go to foreign markets. And so the US, and really the Trump administration in particular here, is saying any foreign power that we consider a competitor that's trying to do this in the hemisphere, we will prevent them from doing so. And the use of competitor here is very important because of the EU, which is very secondary. I'm not going to get into this so much, but as people probably know, the EU recently signed a major trade deal with Europe, which is now in debate in European Parliament, that would massively expand trade between Europe and South America. And the US is very annoyed about this because they want to basically further subordinate actually the EU countries to US interests, and they don't want them to have so much influence or eat up too much of the US company's pie in Latin America. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do questions now until the end. But this is mostly directed at China and Russia, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So they say, non-hemispheric competitors have made major inroads into our hemisphere, the logic of imperialism, both to disadvantage us economically in the present and in ways that may harm us strategically in the future. Allowing these incursions without serious pushback is another great American strategic mistake of recent decades. The United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region. The terms of our alliances and the terms upon which we provide any kind of aid must be contingent on winding down adversarial outside influence. Now we have adversary, not competitor. From control of military installations, ports, and other key infrastructure to the purchase of strategic assets broadly defined. So, we have two things that are quite interesting here. The first helps to explain the discussion of oil, our prosperity. Coded implicitly in Trump's discussion about the US getting the oil is a message to the American consumers, which means not just the working class, but also the petty bourgeoisie, the various office workers, middle managers, or so on. Look, Venezuelan oil, it's good for you. There's no conflict of interest between the US state and the average people. That's what they're saying. Our prosperity is dependent upon the Venezuelan oil. It's going to be a great deal for you. Gas prices will go down, your heating prices will go down. We'll control inflation. That's implicit here. It's notable they have to refer to that, actually. It's a sign of their weakness, as opposed to the ideas of spreading democracy and freedom. They can't credibly say they're spreading democracy and freedom. They try a little bit here, but no one believes that when you kidnap a head of state from another country in the dark of night. Just like no one really believed the narco-terrorist nonsense. But also here, and this is important, they are not totally incorrect from the perspective of imperialist competition that the inroads of Chinese investment, in particular in Central America and Latin America more broadly, is a major, major threat to the US ruling class's global dominance, to the US imperialists. If you have an empire and the close powers that you rely on for trade and that you want to move more trade to in the future are being heavily invested in by your biggest global rival, who's outcompeting you in those markets significantly. This is the financing and investment of numerous infrastructure projects by China in Latin America over the last, I think, few decades. Yes. And you can see a huge amount of projects. And this doesn't even cover, this is just like hard infrastructure. This doesn't cover telecommunications or industry. The ruling class in the US has not been investing nearly as much in new projects there. Now, this challenges the US for a number of reasons. The first is that it obviously weakens US influence in these countries, which means that China could get more resources from them, make more profits that the US corporations could otherwise get. And then the Chinese corporations could be better staged to compete with US companies in global markets. But also, it weakens the supply chains for the US. Because in order to shift investment out of China, which the US ruling class is doing in large droves right now, they need to shift it to other countries. And relying on Latin American countries for some subsection of that production is essential for the US economy, and really for the US ruling class and the capitalists, to not be dependent on the Chinese production for basic medicine, steel, textiles, etc., which right now the US economy still is dependent on a lot of that. And so what we have is, in a sense, the battle for Latin America. This is not yet escalated to so many outright wars. But remember, Lenin, in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, quotes Clausewitz, who wrote about the Napoleonic Wars, who said that war is a continuation of politics by other means. So you don't get a hot war until you've had economic and political competition of this sort, actually. And then a war is a qualitative escalation of that form of competition. So what we're seeing here is the underlying economic groundwork, which is not mechanically causal of the political and military maneuvers, but is very closely related to it and is the substructure on which it's built between the US and China. So let's look at China's trade with Latin America and the Caribbean countries and the US's trade. What we see is that if you take away Mexico, which is part of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, that China actually does several $100 billion a year more in trade with Latin America than the US does, which is to say that China has exceeded the US in a huge number of countries as their biggest trading partner. And you can imagine the US capitalists are freaked the fuck out by this. They say, that's our backyard. They say, those resources, that lithium in Bolivia, that should be ours. The oil in Venezuela, Trump said it's our oil. The soybeans from Brazil, they shouldn't be able to sell those to China because the US wants to sell their soybeans to China to control the Chinese economy and have some leverage over China, really, because China's dependent on food imports significantly. So what's happened is, and the only way we can understand the current events and the withdrawal of the US from so many multinational institutions, which can never be explained by Trump's personality, unless you really believe in the great man theory of history, and we really shouldn't, is the fact, which has been stated over and over and over again in US policy papers, is within the multinational or multilateral institutions and multinational institutions, within the rules-based international order that the US diplomats always would go on about, China is beating the US at their own game. They're outcompeting the US in trade. They're better imperialists than the US. They're succeeding better at plundering Latin American countries. And from the Marxist perspective, the massive, massive, massive investment that China is doing there to extract huge profits and resources basically mirrors all the neocolonial relations the US has. The fact that sometimes they give them slightly better trade terms. 1.5% lower interest rate does not make it not imperialist. And you can see this, the superstructural manifestations of this, and this is just a side note about the nature of the Chinese imperialism in Latin America, in the incessant scandals the Chinese business people have in Latin America and in Africa when all their racist views about the native population comes out, when they call people in Africa monkeys, or they say other racist slurs against people in Latin America. And there's always scandals and strikes and so on, just like there are against US companies there. And US managers have similar scandals, of course. It's the nature of imperialism that's common to both. And I can't get into a full analysis of Chinese imperialism in this presentation. It's just a baseline point I'm making to clarify what China's doing. It's not a benevolent force. What we see, this is the biggest economy in South America, Brazil. Look at China's trade and compare it to the US. I mean, it's almost 3 times the size of US in terms of export destination, and like 1.5 times the size in terms of imports. And what does China export, what does Brazil export to China? Well, crude petroleum, unrefined ore, soybeans, corn, sugar. What do neocolonies generally export to imperialist countries? Raw materials, a lot of them. And what does China sell to Brazil? Refined petroleum. So they send the petroleum to China. China refines it. They sell it back at a surplus. High-end tech equipment, all sorts of stuff the Brazilian economy can't make for themselves because the imperialists prevent them from developing self-sufficiently, and because the prevailing political relations in the South American countries and the cowardly bourgeois leadership of those countries have no real interest in breaking from imperialism. That is, they actively reinforce the imperialist domination of their own countries, get a little wiggle room more or less, sometimes protest, but basically keep their own people in chains in exchange for their own enrichment. Okay, so let's talk about China's investment in Latin America more specifically. The graph I showed earlier covered a lot of the mega infrastructure projects, which are often a source of a lot of consternation in the press. Oh my God, China's building all these new dams and they're outcompeting us, the liberal press generally tending to identify with the US state and the US capitalists. They're outcompeting the US empire, and they are. But if you look at this graph of what's been the infrastructure projects, we see it's actually recently a lot of EVs to secure the electric vehicle market, but also the ICT. Now, what's ICT? It's information and communications technology. How does the US maintain such powerful sway over so many politicians around the world? Well, Epstein, of course, and whoever's replaced Epstein now, and I'm sure there was parallel operations going on the whole time. But how do you get people's secrets to blackmail them? Spying. And what's the philosophy of the NSA? They call it bulk data collection. Get every single bit of electronic communication in the world. All the time. Your phone is constantly recording. You know, do you see that picture of Netanyahu with his camera covered recently? He's got his own domestic Israeli-made smartphone running proprietary software, and he doesn't trust the camera uncovered. Because it's recording all the time. It knows exactly where the phone is in your pocket. It's recording audio and video all the time. And every call you have, every email, even encrypted stuff, they get it all. Now, if Huawei, instead of Verizon, sets up the 5G network in Brazil, who gets that information? The Chinese ruling class. So a huge portion, and this is a long-standing, it goes back to the British Empire too, of how imperialist powers and colonial powers kept other countries in chains was through blackmailing part of the leadership. Oh, you may want to make a little stand here, but we got those photos, we got this call, we know you're compromised, we know you went drunk driving, we know your kid has a drug problem, X, Y, Z, whatever. We know you went to Epstein Island. Okay. So the ICT is something the US is really, really worried about. It's not just the big infrastructure projects. The EVs they're very worried about too, because China capturing the EV market around the world, the American electric vehicles are actually generally of a pretty substandard quality. If people aren't already aware, American cars kind of suck and have sucked for a long time. And the Chinese EVs are better made, they're better cars, they're cheaper, and they will generally outcompete the US made cars in the international markets. And so you can't have a free trade, liberal, rules-based order. You've got to have protectionism. You've got to have military actions, even to keep other countries out, to secure the markets from foreign investment. Because if it's free trade and the door's open to everyone, sort of, free trade was never really free trade. Even then, that's a capitalist paradigm. But if the market's open to everyone and your major imperialist rival is making better products than you and for cheaper, then you're not going to be able to sell as many of them. Your profits go down, your ability to project power goes down, their influence rises, etc. Now, I want to talk about some concern that the US ruling class has had in Latin America. Namely, they've been concerned about the so-called left-wing governments. This is a little bit divided. Who do the US prefer, Bolsonaro or Lula? Lula. Across the board, they preferred Lula. It came out, the Biden administration was strongly behind Lula. What did Obama say about Lula when he met him? This guy, he's the best politician in the world. I wish I could be him. Like, he's so good at this. Like, Obama was obsessed with Lula. So Bolsonaro, even Trump kind of liked Bolsonaro a little bit, but then he talked to Lula, and he's like, actually, I prefer Lula. So how this graph sets it up is misleading, or this map, because we can't really call Lula left-wing. And even some of the so-called left-wing governments that have won elections are, at best, really minorly social democratic. But sometimes they've passed some basic nationalist reforms against imperialists. Other times they've been closer to China and to Russia. And the US ruling class has been very worried about that. But what we've seen in recent elections, in Argentina you have Milei, who gets elected and runs out and has a giant Israeli flag and waving it around, and then comes here to New York for his first trip and meets not with US statesmen, but with Chabad. And like this ultra right-wing Zionist group is like, I've learned so much about economics from reading the Torah. It's insane. But he's like, I love Israel, Israeli investment. We need more Israeli money in Argentina. We want more US money. He's openly declared his support basically for the genocide. Now you have, I'm forgetting his name. I actually have an image of him in a second. In Chile, who won, whose father was a Nazi and who was a big figure in the Pinochet government, his father. And he was basically openly a Nazi himself. And as soon as he wins, the Israeli Foreign Office praises his victory and says they're so glad that he's won. You have, in Ecuador, it's basically a drug state now, based on the US's backing. And you've obviously had massive US intervention to support these rightward shifts in Latin America. We'll go through a few of them. The election is only one manifestation of it, but it's important to see. So there's been not just a rightward shift, but a broad social shift, not just electorally, but also in polling in terms of people's views. How is this accomplished? Well, how does the US make public opinion? How does the capitalists make public opinion? What does the US control? What did they do about TikTok? Forced its sale to Larry Ellison. Can't have too much pro-Palestine content. Got rid of all the major Palestinian creators. That's just a more open version of what they've been doing for years. What they was CBS now, right? Barry Weiss. I saw some commercials in CBS. I didn't realize all of their TV shows now in CBS are cop shows. CIA, FBI, NCIS 27, US Marshals, DEA. Like, it's literally all cop shows. But they also control the social media algorithms. They produce viral stuff that they make go viral on WhatsApp. They manipulate networks, not just the algorithm, to try to promote things using huge amounts of bot accounts. And they control a lot of, not entirely, but which artists are successful. Anyone listen to Mitski? Athena, was it her mom or her dad who's in the CIA? Yeah. Yeah, but think about it. It's like really, I used to listen to Mitski, but it's like really like be really nihilistic and then love your nihilism. There's no way the bourgeoisie has an interest in promoting nihilism. Oh, wait. I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek about Mitski, although I think actually if you listen to the political content of a lot of her music, it's very nihilistic. But overall, they pick winners and losers in the movie industry. That's obvious with Hollywood, right? All the military stuff, in the music industry, etc. And that's not to say there's no wiggle room for real popular stuff. Just look during the feminist movement in Chile a number of years ago. Look at all the music that came out. There was an incredible outflow of popular music that was very radical, and it was great. But they've worked to then clamp down on that shit and make sure reactionary music gets popular. And, we saw this in the US. Jay-Z, Drake, Pusha T, they're all in the Epstein files. Okay, Diddy, his whole operation. And we could go more down that rabbit hole in the efforts to really convince people to believe in capitalism and so on. But there's a large effort by the US ruling class at many levels to ensure that the domestic sentiment in these countries in Latin America shifts to the right and is pro-America, pro-Israel, et cetera, which is actually very challenging because of the outrages that the US and Israel are carrying out. And the long history of outrages of interventions in Latin America. This is from, I think, 10 years ago. It's a graphic of US military interventions in Latin America. I believe this is military interventions after World War II, if I remember correctly. And so this is probably a good 10 or 15 short now. Sorry, I keep moving, so it's fucking with the audio a little bit. But you get a sense. This is what the U.S. has been doing. We had the Monroe Doctrine. Officially, the Monroe Doctrine kind of ends, but this is between now and between the end of the Monroe Doctrine, or at least the end of World War II, and the Donroe Doctrine, which is non-stop coups, military dictatorships, right-wing death squads. And if you start to add in all the work the CIA has done to promote the big drug cartels, it gets way bigger. Guess what else is in the Epstein files? The Sinaloa cartel, all the major cartels. They're all in there. The US state, and even the Trump administration's direct support of them is in there. And like one section of the US capitalists may support one cartel in Mexico. Like, for example, some of the big Texas energy barons, they back one cartel, and then you got the Zetas, then you got the Matacetas, and so on. You've got all these different ones sponsored by different capital interests as Mexico becomes increasingly divided into like almost a warring states situation, like in the Chinese, in the 20s in China, when all the different imperialists sponsored different warlords. This is the history in Latin America, and it's what we're seeing in the present in a new and updated form. A lot of these military interventions in the Cold War era took place because the US was very worried about Soviet influence. Now, we need to divide these interventions, and we'll come to that in a second, because some of them were interventions against real popular movements, and some were interventions actually against basically groups in the 60s that were trying to sell their country out to the Soviet Union, which at that point was, or 70s or whatever, 80s, an imperialist power. Okay, so I don't know if you followed, right in the lead up to Maduro's arrest for narco trafficking, when all the fishing boats were being blown up by the Trump administration, Trump pardoned the former president of Honduras, who famously said, "We're going to shove so much coke up the nose of the gringos, they don't know what's going to happen." He was like the biggest cocaine trafficker. And he got pardoned after serving like 1 year of a 45-year sentence. He was also big with the Biden administration too. They loved him. And Lindsey Graham praised him and so on. He got pardoned and he was released to help Tito win the election there in Honduras. And Trump basically threatened if Tito doesn't win, then something bad will happen. And there's a lot of belief actually the election was rigged pretty much for Tito. And so Honduras is going to become a big set of drug trafficking again. And if we step back a little bit, we can understand why Venezuela. This was testimony that Marshall Billingsley gave to Congress on October 2025. I'll read it in a second, but first let me explain who this guy is. This is a guy, I'm sure I should have looked before this, his name's in the Epstein files. I don't know, I'm basically certain. He was a bureaucrat in the war on terror in the Bush Pentagon. And his main thing was to develop a system of surveillance for the US state under the guise of fighting terrorism of all transactions. A big problem they had is a lot of informal money lending networks in the Islamic world made it very hard for the CIA to track the flow of money around the world. And the financing of, well, some of the terrorist groups they were sponsoring, but then also various popular resistance movements, even if they're religious movements, they're real popular resistance, then they're popular movements, whatever their illusions may be about religion. He pioneered that. Then he pioneered the ability to track Bitcoin transactions. And for those who don't know, Bitcoin was created, in part, Epstein was involved in the creation of Bitcoin and the control of its founders. That was in the last dispatch. And Epstein was working hard with the Emiratis to create a cryptocurrency that was halal, so it would be taken up in the Islamic world, because there was concerns that Bitcoin wasn't halal. And so I don't know if Billingsley was involved in that, but he was doing everything around that. And so he testified in Congress, and he said, when you look at the regime that has sponsored the socialist plague that has spread across Latin America, it's the Venezuelans. It's corrupt, dirty Venezuelan money that underwrote the Petro campaign in Colombia. They funneled money into Mexico. They funneled money into Brazil. Once we have democracy restored in Venezuela, all of that subversion money that has been underwriting the socialist campaigns around the region dries up. So does the oil revenues to the Cuban regime, all of the support to the Nicaraguans. So the solution begins with Venezuela. Now, what he's saying is, you want to overthrow all these other governments? Deal with Venezuela first. Then they have a lot harder time. Cuba doesn't get oil. Hence all the consternation around if Scheinbaum in Mexico is going to give oil to Cuba. Then you can undermine Petro's center-left government in Colombia, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let's be real. In Venezuela, it wasn't socialism. It was social democracy. The guy who wrote the book on the policy in Venezuela is named Heinz Dietrich. He's a German social democrat. He draws his theory from a basically guy, I forget his name, a Russian guy who was like, oh, the Soviet Union after it failed, it collapsed because they tried to get rid of the market. And we need markets and trade for socialism. And we need participatory democracy. And so Heinz Dietrich came up with this whole theory of socialism in the 21st century that the government adopted after Chavez came to power, basically sell oil to the international markets and use the profits from that to support social welfare. And that's socialism. Don't kick out the capitalists. Don't kick out all the imperialists. Do business with them. Don't develop your own domestic industry on your own 2 feet and rely on the people. Have welfare. I mean, politically, it was not so different from some of the welfare reforms passed in the New Deal, which weren't socialist. But then even Heinz Dietrich basically said, oh man, things are so bad in Venezuela, they're not even implementing half of the progressive reforms I suggested, so I'm going to not support it anymore. And he kind of sucks. He draws mostly from Bernstein, who was famously like the first revisionist that Lenin criticized so much. But okay, they did some popular reforms, and that is too much for the US ruling class. They want total control. They want no Russian influence. They want no Chinese influence. They don't want any of the money to be spent on social welfare domestically, even for basic social democratic reforms, because they want that money to be flowing to the pockets of US corporations. And they don't want money to go to helping other countries in the region, even if it's helping them to support the Venezuelan capitalist own interest. They want that to flow to US corporations. And so what have they done? Well, I talked about this a little bit, but okay, Milei. Things were looking bad for Milei. His chainsaw approach to the government fucked up the economy real bad. So what'd they do? $20 billion in US dollar swap lines injected directly into the Argentinian economy right before the midterms to preserve his government. And who's this disturbing gentleman? Nayib Bukele. Nayib Bukele is basically the US appointed governor of what has now become the prison camp that is El Salvador. Now, how did Bukele come to power? Does anyone know? Who were the parties he defeated? He defeated 2 parties in El Salvador, the FMLN and Arena. Arena was like the old right-wing party. FMLN traces its roots back to actually the revolutionary movement. But the revolutionary movement in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the revolutionary leadership got killed off or died or degenerated. And the section of the leaders of the FMLN who aligned with the Soviet Union's foreign policy when the Soviets were, at that point, imperialists, rose to power. And they said, let's have social democracy. Let's have peaceful transformation to socialism. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they allied with China. In the lead up to the election that Bukele won, and I just want to use this as an example to explain the sort of things that are happening. The FMLN promised to make 14% of El Salvador a special economic zone for Chinese corporations, where they would pay no taxes, where there'd be no labor laws, where Chinese companies could repatriate their capital at any time, and about 50% of El Salvador's coastline this would have covered. So a big portion of the area where people are concentrated. And Chinese corporations would have run free. These special economic zones are a model developed by who? The US imperialists. They set these up in India and other places around the world, and they say, your local laws don't apply here, our corporations get to do what they want. China was going to do that to 14% of El Salvador. And there was huge outrage. Arena was totally discredited for years of corruption. FMLN was discredited for years of corruption. The US was promoting all these drug dealers and gangs in El Salvador to cause chaos. And they said, look, we've got our technocrat, Nayib Bukele, he should come to power. And he did. He said, I'll clean up the streets. Now, how do you clean up the streets? And anyone ever seen Clockwork Orange? What happens to Alex DeLarge, the main character's friends who are doing all this, pillaging of people's houses and robbery? Spoiler alert, they become the cops. So he rounds up some drug dealers, but mostly what he does is he turns all of them into police. He throws in, his enemies into prison. And this is just about the special economic zone. Sorry, I should have pulled up sooner. And then he starts welcoming huge numbers of US deportees, some of whom are in gangs, mostly that started in the US and in the US prisons and were promoted by the US, and the gangs in the US prisons are promoted by the US. They're sent to El Salvador. in these massive, massive prison camps. This one, I think, holds 80,000. It's going to be expanded to hold 116,000. Everyone who's in there is in there for life. They say the only way you leave is in a box. It's massively overcrowded. During the day, no one ever gets any time outside. They all, sit down like this, shirtless, or sit in their rooms, no clothes, like no shirts on. And of course, they're brutalized. Now, these prisons are made in El Salvador with the aid of US capital. They're a brand new generation of state-of-the-art prisons meant to surveil prisoners every moment and break them psychologically. And I bet you there's one other way you get out of those prisons, which is you collaborate and become a guard, or you go into some sort of narco-terrorism, narco-trafficking operation they want. If we look at what's happened to El Salvador, and this is a very new development in this country, and it speaks to what the US has planned with the Donroe Doctrine for Latin America. The division of labor. Some countries are going to be prison states. Other ones will make all the cocaine to fuel the CIA's black budget, etc. Look at this. US is pretty high up there. Cuba's pretty high up there. But look at El Salvador. Percentage of the population. I mean, that's crazy. 3 times, the US is crazy in terms of our mass incarceration system. 3 times the US. 3 times. Now, there was a scandal recently because they tried to send a bunch of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador to go to this prison. And they went there for a bit, and then it was exposed. It was going to be aired on CBS, and then Barry Weiss was like, you can't air this. And then it kind of got aired anyways, but yeah. Her wife is in the Epstein files. There's a lot of people in there, as we're finding out. Okay, so how does this all, is there an architecture for all this beyond the Donroe Doctrine? Well, a subset of the Donroe Doctrine, part of it, is what's called the Isaac Accords. The Isaac Accords are parallel to the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords aim to bring together the Gulf monarchies in Israel. Like, oh, Abraham, we all believe in Abraham. We're people of the book of the Old Testament. It's nonsense. But Milei and others with the US sponsorship started the Isaac Accords to bring Latin American countries into extremely close collaboration with Israel. Machado wants this. Her party 10 years ago signed an inter-party agreement with Likud to work very closely with them. And just look, in the narco state that is Ecuador right now, they've signed massive agreements with Israel to have Israeli firms help carry out intelligence operations to fight drug trafficking. Who's trafficking the drugs? The CIA, the DEA, and the government. They're not fighting drug trafficking. They're turning the country into a police state. They're testing out new systems there. Systems that have already been pioneered in Palestine. Even, in supposedly leftist Lula's government, they've been striking huge deals with Elbit. And these deals are really expansions of long-standing deals. Like when Argentina, even before Milei, monitored the Mapuche people in Patagonia, what did they use? Israeli drones. So these are just massive expansions. What they want to do is an unprecedented expansion of US and Israeli influence in Latin America, really as a way to ensure that all this stuff doesn't end up in Chinese hands in terms of surveillance tech and everything. And of course, I mentioned this guy earlier, Cast, the son of a Nazi official whose father was in the Pinochet government. And yeah. So you get a sense of what they have planned, and the US plans are really for Latin America, which is to make it a hellscape and to bring the sort of dystopian surveillance technology that we're seeing ICE roll out, and which has really been built up in the US for the last 20-something years, 25 years since the War on Terror, to deploy that across the globe. And Latin America being a key thing, partially to stop Chinese influence, which they are very worried about, but also, ultimately, they are worried about the people, the popular masses rebelling. And there's a lot of rebellion when there's this level of oppression and resistance, or oppression and exploitation. Okay, so I want to step back now and talk more specifically about some of how the US ruling class is dealing with and trying to confront the strategic competitor, as they put it, their rival imperialist power, China. Because unless we understand their overall framework, everything I've presented to you now is kind of like a flurry of different data points. But we need to group those data points together. I gave you a general framework earlier of that competition. I showed how China's winning the competition and went through a bunch of particular examples, how the US is countering, some of the basic framework they have for countering. But let's now go back to the general level and talk a bit more about the US strategy here. So in the fall of 2023, the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, which is a bipartisan committee. Great to have that sort of working across the aisle in these, polarized times. They published this report, Reset, Prevent, Build, a strategy to win America's competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, geez, they really have a way with words, don't they? It's like when it's not a bad acronym like TARP or something, it's these sort of word salads. Okay. So what do they say about the basic challenges they're confronting? Never before has the United States faced a geopolitical adversary with which it is so economically interconnected. Addressing this novel contest will require a fundamental reevaluation of US policy towards economic engagement with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as well as the new tools to address the PRC's campaign of economic aggression. For the past 2 decades, the PRC is strategically decoupled from the United States, reducing its own dependence on the world while increasing the America's dependence. That is their typo. Maybe they mean like America's plural, I don't know. The America's dependence on the PRC. It has waged a concerted campaign of economic aggression, violating basic standards of trade, property protection, and human rights. The United States now has a choice: accept Beijing's vision of America as its economic vassal, or stand up for our security, values, and prosperity. Now, is this vision wrong? How would you describe the relationship between the British and the US, or the relationship between the German state and the Japanese state in the US? They are economic subordinates of the United States. They tried to do this to Russia too and failed. If China wins the global competition, which may end up in World War III, which maybe no one wins, but if they were to win, they certainly would reduce the US to a power incapable of challenging China as a rival imperialist power. If they didn't, they'd be stupid imperialists. And they have their own stupidities, as all capitalist classes do, but they're not stupid imperialists at that level. You don't let your major global rival, if you beat them in competition, exist to make a comeback. You decimate them. What did the US do? Firebomb Japan, firebomb Germany, destroy the industry, nuke Japan twice, even though they'd already surrendered, basically. It's offered the surrender. The US didn't accept the surrender. And then invest massive amounts of capital in the Dodge and Marshall plans in Japan and Europe, respectively, to ensure that the capitalists that did exist in those countries remain forever subordinate to US interests. And they also have, a few tens of thousands of US soldiers in those countries to kind of make sure everyone stays in line. Now, the Germans and the Japanese are still imperialists, but they're not able to compete with the US on a global scale. And so they're, in a sense, vassals. So on the one hand, this report is somewhat acknowledging the fact that if China does win the economic and geopolitical competition, assuming the US doesn't have a socialist revolution, that the US will be turned, like Germany and Japan were, into a vassal. And that's the basic position that Lenin and the Bolsheviks advocated in the competition between Tsarist Russia and the Central Powers, German government, Austria-Hungary, etc., in World War I, was revolutionary defeatism. Was not to say, oh, we need to defend our country because we'll be worse off if the Germans win and occupy us, but to say we can fight to turn the defeat of our own country in any such conflict into a revolution. And that's how they had the October Revolution. That's a side note, but just to say, we don't, even though some elements of this report are not totally wrong, we shouldn't conclude from that, oh, we need to then support the US because if China wins, we'll be a vassal or something like that. That's what the US ruling class wants us to think is the only two options. It's something of a tangential point, but it's essential to understand how we should orient ourselves in this competition as communists, which is to say, to fight firm to advance the cause of proletarian revolution and not try to pick the supposed lesser evil of the imperialist powers, whether we believe China's lesser evil or the US is lesser evil. So to deal with this problem of massive interconnection economically with China, Trump has come up with a strategy. The Donroe Doctrine is only part of that. And this strategy it's not really Trump's, it's been a massive debate. This debate was the deciding issue in the last election. actually, in terms of which sections of the bourgeoisie backed which candidate. If you listen closely, the section that backed Trump wanted much more aggressive policies on China than the people who backed Kamala. And most of the swing voters amongst the bourgeoisie, who really decide the elections with their money and influence and so on, went for Trump in the end. So the strategy they have is complicated. Let me explain briefly some history before I get into this. In Lenin's time, in the period immediately following the race for Africa, the European imperialist powers and Japan and the US each had their relatively separate domains. There was British India. There was, the Donroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. There was, French West Africa. There was German Southwest Africa, etc. There was the Belgian control of the Congo and all the horrors that happened there. And there was a global market, but these were separate spheres. Post-World War II, there was a unification of the world imperialist system into what was known as the Bretton Woods system. There's a lot to say about the Bretton Woods system. I will not provide a comprehensive analysis here. But basically, the US was the top dog. All the other imperialists participated. The US played the role of world policeman. And this was opposed by the socialist camp. At that point, the Soviet Union and some of the Eastern Bloc countries. And then after 1949, China. But then capitalism was restored in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union became an imperialist power, even though they called themselves still a communist country. They adopted market reforms called the Lieberman reforms, ran their country according to profit, set up neo-colonial relations with places like Cuba, where Cuba was like a sugar factory for the Soviet Union, and so on. And then you had two imperialist systems, basically separate. You had the Soviet one, which was called Comecon, not Comic-Con, Com-Econ, and you had the Bretton Woods system, which kind of started to fall apart and was called Bretton Woods II. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restoration of capitalism in China, the latter happened around 1976, and Deng Xiaoping says to get rich is glorious, comes to the US, puts on a cowboy hat, invites American businessmen in, brings back prostitution, all that stuff. And then you get hundreds of millions of migrant laborers, the privatization of industry, everything. You have all the big powers in the world unified in one global system led by the US. But within that system, one unity, there's emerged an antagonistic pole, the Chinese imperialists. And so now, the US has faced a situation they've never faced. One unified world system, and you do $500 billion of annual trade with your biggest rival. And they make your steel and your medicine and a lot of the components for your chips, and they control your rare earths. And what the fuck do you do? And the US bourgeoisie, in case anyone hasn't realized, is not exactly subtle right now. They're pretty heavy-handed. So the intricacies of reconfiguring global supply chains in a way that benefits the US ruling class is not a simple task. And they're really struggling to do so. But Trump came up with a strategy, well, his policy people. Aggressive tariffs. These were not Trump being a crazy man. This was advocated very clearly by Robert Lighthizer and other members of the first Trump administration. They were continued by the Biden administration. They've been intensified by Trump too, as a means by which to force other countries to accede to US demands because the existing establishment and the State Department wasn't reliable for doing this, and because you needed to rely on forms of coercion that the US didn't have, some of the forms of soft power the US used to use to control their countries are weaker. So denying countries access to the US domestic market, which is the biggest consumer market in the world, is an essential tool of leverage, as is threatening to cut off access to US dollars and so on and so forth. These aggressive tariffs aim to do two things: force other countries to bend to the US will, but also force countries and some American companies who didn't want to get out of China. Hence why we see Apple making iPhones in India now. Hence why we see chip production partially coming back to the US. Hence why we see all these different things happening. They're part of a global strategy, very messy and ham-fisted, with lots of different actors trying to secure their own stake, different US companies with different interests fighting to make sure their interests get protected and not other companies, other US companies even. European companies competing with US companies and so on. A rapid restructuring of the global economy. Now, to shift production out of China, you can't just shift it all back to the US. You need a plan of friendshoring, nearshoring, and reshoring. The plan is move highly capital-intensive industries, what Marxists call high organic composition of capital industries, things with a heavy degree of automation back to the US. Auto, especially because you can turn auto into military production, like what's his name said, Palmer Luckey, that crazy CEO of that defense company, the guy who wears the Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops. He said, we did it in World War II, turned all the car factories into tank factories. We should be ready to do that again. So bring back the auto production to the US. It's essential for World War III or even for another Ukraine war. But then for the lower, less capital-intensive industries, the ones with a lot of labor, where labor costs are so high in the US, send them to Mexico, send them to South America. Oh, what happens if China controls South America? Can't access the pool of cheap labor, which is just as important, in certain cases, more important for the imperialists than the resources. Because ultimately, it's the people that are the most important resources. And then friendshoring, shift some stuff to allied countries, India, elsewhere that aren't China. And the thing about the Ukraine war is that showed the US that the US defense industrial base is weak. I mean, Russia's producing, hundreds of these drones a day, the suicide drones, other ones. The US is barely able to keep up with just supplying artillery shells, forget about drones. And the drone warfare in Ukraine is changing on a not yearly basis, not decade basis, a monthly basis, the meta of how the drone warfare works, which means the imperialists need to be able to shift the production of their weapon systems for these proxy wars at the level of months. So you need a supply chain that's set up for that and is sufficiently flexible for that. And you can't do that if you're making all the components for the drones. Even if you make the drones in the US, if you're making the components in China, you can't do that. And if you're making the components in a country in Latin America that suddenly flips and goes, to be pro-Chinese imperialism, you can't do that. They're like, hey, we don't want the US money here, or we're going to make you pay way more, or we have security concerns about this, or whatever. And then we have flowing from all this, the Donroe Doctrine. So we can't understand it unless we understand this whole picture. Sorry, I put my hand in front of it. Normally the projector's up there so I can gesticulate a little bit more, but unless we understand this whole picture, we don't understand the Donroe Doctrine. And what I'm spelling out here for you all is a very quick summary of the policy. We wrote a very long paper, 70 pages, not so long, about what we call neo-mercantilism, the end of neoliberalism and the shift towards a mercantilist policy that's on our website that you can read. It covers this shift in detail. It was published before the election, so 2024, sorry. A key policy here is unilateral action to force allies' hands. We see this with stuff like Greenland. We see it with South Korea. Liberals wring hands over this. Oh, Trump's withdrawing from multilateral institutions. There's a correct thing there of okay, yeah, this indicates a much more aggressive US. On the other hand, what the liberals generally say is, oh, this is going to isolate the US, blah, blah, blah. No, the US capitalists have determined that the multilateral institutions are no longer effective means of securing their interests. There's basically consensus on that now. So they abandon them. If you get outcompeted in the World Trade Organization and China wins a bunch of rulings against you, which happened, what do? You say, fuck the WTO. If the UN starts to make a bunch of resolutions, basically criticizing your little ethno-settler state and calling it, calling for the arrest of the head of it, what do? Withdraw from the UN. Sanction the ICC. I mean, yes, that's the actions of an empire in decline, but we can't fall into liberal illusions of being like, I wish the empire was in that golden age with Clinton and yeah, pretty dark, actually, those wishes. I wish I was doing well enough so I could go back to brunch to turn off my brain and not think about Epstein and not think about the genocides. That was the dream when I could vegetate. Yikes. And people don't say it like that, but damn, capitalism is a fucked up system. To want to go back to when you didn't have to have things so bad so you could pretend there weren't such big problems in the world, that's a pretty dark disposition. Okay. Another aspect of this is the aggressive expansion of executive power. Now, I need to be clear here. One administration to the next, since the Nixon administration, really before, but especially since Nixon, we've seen the US ruling class massively increase the power of the executive branch over the legislative and the judicial. This has been not because of some mad evil scheme by Dick Cheney or Donald Trump. It's been a reflection of the objective class needs of the bourgeoisie, because their state institutions, and in particular the legislative branch, has been unable to resolve the basic contradictions capable of carrying out effective forms of class rule and decision-making. It's very hard to get Congress in line. Think about like how they've got to do things. There are all these parliamentary procedures. They can't get a supermajority. There's very rarely votes that aren't very close. So you just flip one or two senators one way or another. And so most of what they do is just executive orders. Each president, one to the next, there's way more executive orders. It's actually substantially increased with Trump too. But it's taken to another level here, both with DHS and the rollout of ICE into the streets, but also with the stuff with the oil in Venezuela, setting up this account in Qatar, totally circumventing Congress at an unprecedented and openly blatant level. Because Congress expects some of that, and they kind of beg for it with their like milquetoast war powers resolutions they don't even pass. Basically saying Trump doesn't have to talk to Congress, even though the president's supposed to talk to Congress to make war. But they need to massively expand the executive. And Trump's doing that to basically shift more and more away from the remaining aspects of bourgeois democracy that exist in the US, so that the executive just does most of the decision making. And on the one hand, that's more efficient in a certain sense because you don't have to go through Congress. On the other hand, it's a major liability because it lays bare the blatantness of the system and its true nature as a dictatorship of a class over the broad masses. But also, it creates huge amounts of subjectivism to concentrate that much power in one hand or in a small group of people, the White House counsel and the cabinet. And it also allows for massive corruption and the defending of an individual's special interests if they either control the presidency or have an ear of the president. So like, for example, some capitalists, like Amazon, they want to appease Trump. And part of why Bezos wants to appease Trump is he doesn't want to shift so much of his investment out of China because they rely on a huge amount of Chinese goods. So what does he do? Trump, I'm going to bid and win the bid to make the documentary about Melania. And I'm going to make sure it's the most stupid puff piece ever made. And he does that. It's like open bribery and corruption. And then Trump says, okay, Bezos, maybe you don't have to move so much of stuff out of China. We'll revisit some of those things we were going to do that were going to hurt Amazon's bottom line. That's a liability because the collective interests of the capitalist class as a whole are distinct from the interests of individual capitals. So one corporation or capitalist may get stupid fucking rich off of doing business with a rival imperialist power. They had to coerce, as an example, Henry Ford to get him to make his cars factories make tanks. Why? In World War II. Because the guy was a fucking Nazi. He received the highest award anyone could receive who wasn't a German citizen from the Nazi party. And a bunch of US manufacturers sold weapons and oil to Japan up until Pearl Harbor. Now, the US government knew they were going to eventually go to war with Japan, but those individual capitalists got stupid rich off of that. So this expansion of executive power undermines the mechanisms by which you keep the individual capitalists in check. Because they can, if they get access to the White House, they can have whatever they want almost happen. And the Congress isn't there to check that and say, get in line, we're going to break up your company if you don't stop selling goods to China or whatever. And it came out recently that a major US tech firm is providing the Wi-Fi equipment to power Russia's war in the Ukraine. So as one example. And then there's this mass deportation stuff and child labor. Now, this is interesting because initially Trump came out with very aggressive rhetoric on immigration and was going to do mass deportations at a very high scale. He's done, I think, basically 2.5 times what Biden did. So that's a lot. That's a lot of fucking deportations. But it's not the scale he was talking about initially. Part of that was maybe campaign rhetoric, but also a lot of big capitalists, Purdue, others, they rely on undocumented people or semi-documented people who have some legal status, but it's very tenuous and tied to their employment, to do all the work in the chicken factories, on the fields, in the meat processing plants, et cetera. And so Trump backed off some of the stuff around deporting people. But how does the US economy get access to cheap labor if not relying on people who are here basically because the capitalists brought them here after bombing or destroying or sanctioning their countries to get them to work for hella cheap with no rights or basically no rights. And then as soon as they protest, deport them, which is how ICE functioned for a long time. Now it's a little bit different, obviously. Well, the solution is child labor. Hence why Sarah Huckabee Sanders, as governor of Arkansas a few years back, rolled back child labor laws. Hence why it's happening in Florida, because historically with child labor, you have the kids work for less because they're kids. And so you can find exemptions to federal minimum wage laws, but also even if you're paying them the minimum wage, which you can't really pay a lot of workers, and like in New York City, you couldn't pay someone the federal minimum wage, things are just too expensive. So child labor is the way around that because the parents pay for some of the child's living expenses and so on. So that's the grim future that's in store for us. There's a lot more to the global strategy. I focused partially here on some of the key elements, but hopefully gives you a sense of what the Donroe Doctrine then is about. This friendshoring, reshoring, reconfiguring the US economy, reconfiguring the global economy, sanctioning any country that really wants to do too much trade with China, etc. So to get a sense of what lays ahead of us as the US government ramps up operations in the wake of this military operation, effectively an active war with Venezuela, we should look back to Operation Condor and what the US government did in Latin America, mostly in South America, but some of it unofficially was done in Latin America too as part of Condor, in the Cold War. For those who don't know, Condor, I think officially ran like up until the 80s, but it was basically the program by which the US carried out coups, assassinations, disappearances, and mass arrests of any dissidents in all these countries. Officially, okay, so this is a CIA program. They aligned with the right-wing military dictatorships in South America. It officially started with Pinochet's government after it came to power, but it was really going on effectively before that. Operation Condor was just an expansion because, of course, they brought Pinochet to power in the first place. They really focused specifically on communists, leftists, and unionists. And they wanted to ensure that these military dictatorships, the stability of them that they set up, would be ensured by the elimination of any dissent and any ability of the working class to organize at all. The explicit aim of Condor was eliminating Marxist subversion. And here, as I've mentioned before, we have to differentiate between real revolutionary forces and some of the Soviet-aligned revisionists. Now, look, the situation with Allende is interesting because they come to power, and what do? To show that they're benevolent, they disarm their party. They give all their guns over to the military. I mean, damn. What? And the Chinese communists warned them, like, look, you came to power, you won an election, okay, they're not really socialists, but they're promising some reform. Don't give up your guns. And they did. And the result was catastrophic. And that doesn't decrease the US crimes, but it speaks to some of the differentiation you have to make. Now, Allende was something of a popular reformist. There were some groups that were just like total proxies for Soviet interest, and there were some revolutionary groups. And then within the revolutionary groups, there was often big debates over how to understand the nature of the world situation, the Soviet Union, China, and so on. And there's more to be said about that. But the point is here that the US government targeted under this title of eliminating Marxist subversion, both real revolutionary forces and proxy forces for the Soviet Union. Here's, of course, the lovely Henry Kissinger, he's dead, thank God, and Pinochet meeting. And here's a report published in Spanish. You can read it if you can read Spanish, but I just wanted to highlight the numbers here. 50,000 people assassinated in the official 8-year span. 30,000 disappeared and 40,000 arrested. Those are the official numbers that the journalists basically could put together in that official 8-year period. This is the sort of hell that the Donroe Doctrine will bring to the people of Latin America, and probably on a bigger scale, because now you're going to have the Israeli spy tech, you're going to have Palantir there, you're going to have all these drones. You can imagine. So this brings us to really our last question, at least of the presentation, then we'll do Q&A. Why not regime change? Why not a big war? I've hinted at this a little bit earlier, but I'll talk it through. Well, first, the invasion of Iraq was fairly decisive in deciding U.S. military policy for handling these wars and military operations in oppressed countries. The invasion of Iraq failed catastrophically. And with the development of the insurgency, and especially after the defeat in the Battle of Fallujah, we had what was called the Surge. And I'll share some more information about this later. The Surge in Iraq was basically a psyop. Yes, a bunch more troops were sent there, but the real surge was the handing over of the entire war to the Joint Special Operations Command under the guidance of McChrystal, who carried out a program of targeted nighttime assassinations of anyone and everyone who they thought might be involved in fighting the US. Nighttime raids to murder. And then they go in to kill someone. None of them spoke Arabic, the people carrying this out. None of their assets spoke Arabic. Like none of the people who came there as translators and so on really spoke Arabic well. They carried out these assassinations, and then they just grab the person's cell phone after they kill him. All the contacts, add them to the kill list. Kill them, add them to the kill list. Kill them, add them to the kill list. That's how the Iraq War was fought. That and drone strikes. And that's the founding. Now, we have to understand a little bit how the US came to even have this basically thing like Delta Force. People know SEAL Team 6, they're the most famous, infamous, but Delta Force is above them. Like SEAL Team 6 and Army Rangers are here, there's Delta Force, and then there's even a secretive branch of the Army that's above that, above Delta Force, that there's really no documentation on. Now, what's it called? Analysis is all they call it, I believe. The assignment. Yeah, the assignment. Yeah, that's it. They just call it the assignment. And no one knows officially, there's no public records of what it does and so on. It's just, it operates out of Fort Bragg, and you know what goes on at Fort Bragg. People may not know. We'll get there very briefly. Okay, so to understand this, it's really essential to read Seymour Hersh's reporting. He's perhaps the greatest living American journalist. He exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, Abu Ghraib in Iraq. He showed pretty decisively that the so-called sarin attacks by Assad was repressive, but the sarin attacks were actually coordinated or done not by Assad, but by Turkish intelligence in conjunction with the far-right groups that have now taken over Syria, and so on. He's an incredible journalist. And he has this article published in the London Review of Books, because no US paper would publish it, about the development of special operations in the US during the Cold War, and in particular under the Reagan administration. For those who don't know, Reagan was kind of like Trump before Trump was Trump, a total idiot of a president who couldn't even be bothered to read anything. They had to make VCRs for him because he wouldn't read briefings. So they have like a little video they made every day. And you go, wow. But Bush ran the presidency. He had been head of the CIA and he ran the presidency. And after all this stuff in the 70s and the anti-Vietnam war protests and the CIA's revelations of what the CIA did in the Church Committee hearings, the fact that they had heart attack guns where they shoot you, a piece of ice goes into you, then you have a heart attack and you die, and there's no bullet hole because it's ice. They put periwinkle poison or something in there. The fact that they were spying on Americans, even though that was illegal throughout the whole Vietnam War protests, all the dirty wars they were fighting, Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, all this stuff, they were really discredited. And there was a system set up to oversee the CIA's covert operations called a finding, where you had to give a report to Congress. And back then, Congress made more of a pretense of doing something. So they set up an informal office that became Special Operations Command out of Bush's office. Bush coordinated with the CIA, and they had the military start carrying out all these special operations. For those who don't know, the CIA basically now does more drone strikes every year than the US Army. And those are all off the books, and all the counts of drone strikes aren't there. And the CIA is the biggest drug trafficking cartel in the world, second only to the US Army. Where do you think all the heroin that surged after the Afghan war came from? The CIA and the US Army trafficking it. And so you see right here, the CIA would provide us a list of bad guys, and we were focused on the drug war and the anti-communist operations. Okay, and they just go and kill people. And every day they meet in Bush's office and talk about it. And this eventually became institutionalized, as it says, through JSOC, or Joint Special Operations Command, which is based out of Fort Bragg. It has the shortest chain of command in the entire military. There's just one general who oversees it, who reports directly to the president. So it's set up to really be the actual fighting force in all the wars. And for those of you who haven't read, actually a bestseller last year, The Fort Bragg Cartel, it's really an essential must-read to understand the nature of the US military and the nature of these operations that are carried out, like what was happened in Venezuela, which was carried out by Delta Force. In this book, Seth Harp basically breaks down the drug trafficking and everything else going on at Fort Bragg, and then leaves open the million questions that are still open about this. This is discussing the surge in Iraq and how JSOC ran it. I'm not going to read it all here, but he just basically describes what they call the continuous targeting cycle, which is basically a McKinsey jargon, McKinsey, the consulting firm that McChrystal took up, to basically say, let's just keep killing people. Kill them, grab their data, kill people in their list, so on, so on, so on. And this was called the F3 EAD or feed. And as he notes at the very bottom of this was greatly aided by the widespread adoption of cell phones in Iraq, which was brought about with the US invasion. And so you can imagine in countries like Latin America, where they already have massive amounts of cell phones, everyone does, and where now they're bringing in Israeli spy tech, and the US is working hard to make sure that it's US infrastructure that controls the cell phone markets and so on, what sort of hell they'll bring as they roll out a new Operation Condor, which I think we're basically certain to see in Latin America with Milei and others governments. That is a fairly targeted program to kill leftists across the board. Okay, so let's step away from JSOC. So part of the reason they went for this form, which is now the way they fight the wars, and they're going to rely on this until they have to fight a big positional war against another country like China, or maybe Iran, is a concern, as we saw with the Trump clip earlier, of a repeat of Iraq and Libya, where they go in, they intervene, they put boots in the ground or mercenaries on the ground, and the country is totally destabilized, and they can't control it, and they can't set things up. And they realized Machado has no support, and she got no support. So they said, can we find someone in the Maduro government who will work with us? And Delcy Rodriguez, she's their girl. They also want a stable situation in Venezuela to prevent more migrants, even though the US sanctions was a huge factor driving all the immigration, or emigration out of Venezuela. But they also want to send back all the Venezuelan migrants, because there was such a scandal when Bukele was going to take them. So they want to basically say, send them all back, send them all back. It'll be a great thing for them, and we'll get a win at home, deporting people. And then most importantly, Delcy's playing ball. And I don't just mean she's doing some things that you have to do in this situation where you're potentially going to be invaded. I mean, she met with Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA. She's expressed her open support for US investment. She was, as is broke, very clear that she would cooperate closely with the US before Maduro was captured. This is her meeting with Ratcliffe. And shortly after her meeting with Ratcliffe, she announced this was broken by Dropsite, but it was public actually. Dropsite just provided some analysis. A so-called reform of their hydrocarbon laws, which basically are enshrined in the Venezuelan constitution, which limit the degree of foreign control of their oil reserves. This opens up, which it passed unanimously, no lawmaker stood up against it. It's being decried by leftists in Venezuela as selling the whole country to the US for nothing. It opens up the oil fields to foreign control entirely, which we'll see happen very quickly, I think, with some nominal sum of the money being paid to Delcy Rodriguez and the people who are going along with this in her government. The standard is like a 10% cut of the profits. Famously, both Saddam and Gaddafi took 20%, and the imperialists, really couldn't handle that. So you see kind of how the game is played. And actually this led to a split in the Venezuelan Communist Party, which historically was has been recently a very meek and party that basically just supported Maduro. But since his kidnapping, they've basically said, and a bunch of other groups, this is just one I pulled because they split, it was relevant, I thought, that this is a sellout by Maduro, or sellout by the Delcy Rodriguez and the Maduro government before this, and that they're turning the country into a neo-colony. And they said notably that for a long time, anyone who critiqued the Maduro government were labeled CIA assets or agents. And now they're meeting with the fucking CIA. So I mentioned all of this in closing to both clarify why there wasn't regime change, properly speaking, like we saw with Iraq, but also to warn about a series of very prevalent illusions in the US left that say, oh, just support the Venezuelan government. Look at all these mobilizations. It seems clear, based on this sort of high level and extremely obsequious collaboration with the US, that the government in Venezuela is now carrying out some basic protests against the US simply because they have to maintain some legitimacy while simultaneously selling out the entire country to US imperialism, signifying they will be as big of compradors as the US needs and wants. Now, the position of a sellout, a comprador is what historically they've been called in the Maoist movement, is not a comfortable position. They may fight for a little wiggle room here or there, but this sort of basically structural adjustment program to allow the US to take over the oil industry in Venezuela is not a minor concession. It's saying take the whole country, which they were already saying in negotiations beforehand, so it's not a surprise. That basically concludes the presentation. Hopefully, at this point, you have something of a sense of more of what the Donroe Doctrine is, of what the hell is that the US imperialists have planned for Latin America, of what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it in competition with China. And I guess, well, I'll say two things. First, the hope is that this also raises for you all a bunch of questions to investigate and learn more about, because there's a tremendous need to learn more about it, to follow the current events and developments very closely, and to study and apply Marxism to analyze things. It's not a bad thing to walk away from a presentation like this with a lot of questions. It's part of the goal. I also want to be square that I've painted a fairly bleak picture here. And I think this sort of frank analysis is needed to have any real revolutionary optimism. A lot of what we're fed in the media is either total nihilism, like Mitski, sorry Mitski fans, or naive optimism, magical thinking. Just believe in you and you'll make your dreams realize. Just manifest it, this bullshit. And then if you didn't do it, it's just your fault. You didn't manifest it enough. Because the external reality and all the class forces and oppression, that couldn't have been the reasons that your dreams didn't come true and you got screwed over every turn. And these are two sides of the same coin. Revolutionary optimism and a real belief in the infinite creative capacity of the masses of people can only be based upon a frank and objective assessment. It can never be based on any sort of lesser evilism. And that's frankly what a lot of groups, unfortunately, in the US historically have promoted. A lesser evilism of saying, oh, well, look at China, it's less evil than the US, so that's good. Less evil of the Democratic Party, less evil of the pink tide governments in Latin America, which we should be clear, we should oppose US interventions, but we can't say these are the solution to the problem, some basic social welfare. The only way forward is a very challenging period that the world's entering into of intense disorder and chaos and struggle. But historically, these extremely challenging periods, which involve very painful revolutions. When you think about the Russian Revolution, it happened in the context of a world war and a massive famine in Russia, are actually possible. And they are possible, especially in times of chaos, which come about not because of the will of communists or the organization of the masses, but because of the objective process of the contradictions between the various forms of capital competing around the world. Their system is unsustainable. It's self-destructing. It generates crisis after crisis. And if we're well prepared, and if we're not longing for a retreat to the supposed glory days of the 90s or the 50s or whatever, some of the alt-right thinks the 50s were the greatest time ever, or the 1880s, I don't know. And if we can have a clear head, then we can actually find a way forward. And finding a way forward, and I will end with this, means something very specific. Marx said, under capitalism, the past rules over the present. The bloodshed, the violence, the slavery, the colonialism, the capital accumulation, the just insane barbarism of the ruling classes before the capitalists, the kings and monarchs and emperors, before them, the slave-owning classes of classical antiquity and so on, or the slave owners of the antebellum self. Their process of accumulation, that past determines the present, because that past led us to this moment where this huge collective wealth of humanity is concentrated in a tiny number of hands. And that past continues to determine their present because they use their wealth, that's really our wealth, the wealth of the people, to rule over us and to keep us in chains. But Marx says under communism, the future rules over the present. Not some naive utopian future that we build in our minds, but a future that we can rationally understand and work to bring about. And that's really the vision of communists, to bring about that society, but also to fight now. Say it makes sense, despite the great challenges in front of us, despite the incredible suffering that people already experience and will intensify in the world. It makes sense to have the courage to unite and to come together and to face reality as it is and to fight. And that's not an easy task. And that's just a starting point. But that is the task of communists. So thank you all very much, and we'll open it to Q&A. Okay, I'll take 3 questions first. We'll do them in 3 person chunks. So I see 1. Any more? 2, 3. Okay. Yeah, I'll repeat the question too. So go ahead, Sai.
So obviously we as U.S. communists have a responsibility to sort of debunk the narratives that are being fed to the American masses, like such as, oh, we have to go to Venezuela because the oil is going to be cheaper and that'll be good for us as consumers. So that's a thing we need to combat. But what about what's our responsibility as American communists to debunk some of the narratives that are going to be told to the South American masses and the Latin American masses that's also going to come as a response to these policies?
So the question is, what is our responsibility as communists in the US to help clarifying to the people of Latin America the various lies and distortions that will be spread, either by the US ruling class or by various forces in their respective countries? It's an incredibly important one. First, given the role of the US in the world as part of the nature of the imperialist system, a lot more attention is unfortunately paid to things that happen here as opposed to elsewhere. For example, can be very powerful mass movements in oppressed countries or even in other imperialist countries, and they barely make a pip in international media. But even some relatively weak protests in the US can have a big impact. To give a sense, there's incredible mass movement against the Modi government in India, the fascist government there. A lot of different levels of resistance. And a number of years back, there was this big roundup of activists in this thing called the Bhima Koregaon case. They basically framed all these major leftist intellectuals, lawyers, human rights people, etc., called them terrorists, threw them in jail. And there was big protests in India. The government ignored them. There was a relatively modest protest that I helped to organize and partook in outside the Indian consulate here in New York City, a few hundred people. And the Indian government got very scared. And actually, they were in the midst of prepping a next round of arrests and basically started to back off, is what some journalists in India told myself and others. So that gives a sense of some of the impact we can have. Now, that's not specifically to answer your question directly about, it doesn't fully answer your question about debunking things. But that is to say, or from that we can draw that basically, if very good analysis is put out from groups in the US about the situation with US machinations in Latin America, it's likely to get some traction in a way that, because of the unjust nature of the imperialist system, sometimes very good analysis from groups in those countries doesn't get as much traction. But here's the thing that we also have to consider, is there are important communist groups in these countries. For example, the Maoist organization in Colombia, they published a very, very good criticism, a series of criticisms over the years of the policies undertaken in Venezuela and the idea of socialism in the 21st century that Hugo Chavez took up. Now, their analysis is from the left and providing a very good criticism of the limitations of this and how it would eventually lead exactly to this sort of situation where either the government of Venezuela would basically have to capitulate to the US, or they would have to totally accept domination by China or Russia. And so actually we have a responsibility as communists in the US to publish and clarify those forms of analysis, translate them into English, etc. Because there are a lot of groups that are unfortunately basically not well known because of the imperialist biases here and around the world in countries in Latin America that are very important. And then you can extend it further. We have to also extend our support to them in one way or another. Translating or popularizing their analysis is only part of that. And all of that is part of our internationalist duty as communists, because the proletariat's nature as a class, even though it must settle its score with its own ruling class in its respective country first, the proletariat's nature as a class is truly international. And that's why Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto say that workers of the world ultimately have no country. Okay, second question.
I also want to ask more on, like, this is like a big threat to the whole Latin America, and and recently there has been escalation with Cuba and Mexico. So Venezuela, you have countries like regions like populous AMLO, China, that, and I want to there is clearly a need for a big anti-imperialist struggle in the region as a whole, from Cuba to Mexico to everywhere there. And what is your what would you say as the take on the tasks of communists in these places to? So I know it's a little loaded question, task force of communists of Latin America, but I was wondering, especially with the escalation in Mexico and Cuba.
Yeah, the question is two or threefold, but just to repeat it for everyone, it's the question, what are really the tasks of communists in Latin American countries, especially places like Cuba or Mexico, where there's, or maybe even Colombia, where there's increased pressure from the US and attacks and so on. In an oppressed country, a country oppressed by imperialism, there's generally two main enemies. One is the domestic ruling class of the country, and then the other, sometimes ruling classes, where there's still some remnants of feudalism. Most Latin American countries are, at this point, very capitalist in their development overall, not so feudal. And then the imperialists themselves. And actually, the imperialists pull the strings of the domestic ruling class, even when there's supposed left populists like AMLO. And so there is an incredible need of the communists in those countries to wage the struggles along strict anti-imperialist lines. That is to really expose in their propaganda, but in their deeds, the connection between the domestic rulers and the foreign imperialists, and how those domestic rulers sell out the country. Now, I'll refer to India again because it's a great example. How does Modi bill himself? He's a big Indian nationalist. He's a patriot. He's making India strong, making India great again. He's going to do Make in India. So there's going to be more products made in India, more jobs. India's going to be a superpower by 2025, or 2050. What has Modi done? One of his big reforms when he got into office, 100% foreign direct investment is now welcome in India. That means a foreign company can come up and set up their base in India, and there's no Indian domestic capital that has to be involved in that. That's extremely open door to foreign capital to run the country. So a lot of these rulers in the domestic, a lot of rulers in oppressed countries, in Latin American countries is no different, present themselves as populists. It's hard to rule actually right now in those countries as a technocrat. If you look at Mexico, it's a great example. The Party of Institutional Revolution was so thoroughly discredited. I mean, they had scandals. Luis Videgaray de Caso, who is now at the MIT AI thing sponsored by, Epstein, but Friedman, Steven Schwarzman. Yes, Schwarzman. Yeah. Thank you. He was first he was the foreign minister and then also the finance minister of Mexico. Just to give a sense, the party, this technocratic party, they were discredited because they were involved in, he's just one guy, just one of the scandals they were involved in. He set up charity fund that used Mexican government money and some US aid money for kids suffering from cancer. they took all that money for themselves and gave the kids IV drips of water. So that's the sort of scandals that have discredited these technocratic governments. So you have either right or left populists in a lot of Latin American countries. Because the neoliberal parties, it's hard for them to be electorally viable at present. And there's differences in each country. In the case of Morena in Mexico, is a left populist government. But if you look at the big bourgeoisie in Mexico, like Carlos Slim, what did he say about Morena and AMLO? AMLO's like, I'm just a modest guy. I'm fighting neoliberalism. I don't fly on a private jet. I ride commercial airlines. Slim said, Morena, the biggest, wealthiest person in Mexico, he was at one point the wealthiest person in the world. He owns the Times, right? Yeah. AMLO and Morena are our last chance for national unity. If AMLO and Morena, and now Scheinbaum, the current president, is part of Morena, don't win, we're not going to have a unified country anymore. The different warring cartels are going to break it apart. And those are also sponsored by the imperialists. Different sections have different interests. What did AMLO do? He supported the sending of troops to Haiti. And what did Scheinbaum do when she got into office? She promised that one of her main tasks would be extending the NAFTA 2.0, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, to Central America and the Caribbean, to bring more of those countries into this new free trade deal for neo-mercantilism, not neoliberalism. That's the work of the imperialists. That's what they want. So these sort of exposures are essential to be made. And there has to be strong popular fights against these on anti-imperialist lines, because the success of the various domestic ruling classes in oppressed countries, at present, a lot of them is contingent upon populist appeals, which involve often some correct criticisms of the corrupt institutions they've replaced or corrupt parties they've replaced. But people need to be presented a real anti-imperialist alternative and ultimately a real communist alternative. There's tremendous amount more to be said, but the tasks in each of those countries are also fairly distinct. These are very general points. Given my own limitation, and inherently actually a limitation of anyone in the US, we're not going to be able to say so well what the concrete situation is in those countries and how to guide the contours of the struggle daily. And this, in a different sense, is one of the lessons of the Third International, the Communist International, is that in the 20s and 30s, there was an attempt correctly to have coordination of communist parties around the world. And for the after the success of the October Revolution, for the Bolsheviks to provide tremendous support and resources, training, education, etc., to the communist parties around the world. But there was an incorrect view that the Comintern should lead the world revolution, which functionally meant actually that the Bolshevik Party in Moscow played a disproportionate and outsized role in guiding the party's development around the world. And it wasn't possible from Moscow to really grasp the contours of the struggles in their concrete nature in these other countries. And it hamstrung a lot of the parties around the world that never developed their own domestic leadership. They just relied on the leadership they got from Moscow. And so, a lot of opportunity was lost in that period. And in a certain sense, we're entering into a period of similar turmoil right now. So we also don't want to repeat those mistakes. Not that you're saying we should. I'm just going off that point. I think you were the next question.
So you spoke about how U.S. imperialists have this big the Marco states with various inequity. I wonder, do Chinese imperialists do a similar thing, or is that just a U.S. imperialist?
Thank you. The question was, do Chinese imperialists promote the creation of narco states like the U.S. does? The answer, in short, is yes, although the scale and scope of Chinese operations in this regard are nowhere near as big. The most clear example is the Chinese support for Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Now, it's complicated because the Philippines during this period remained overall within the U.S.'s sphere of influence, but China had a lot of ties to Duterte. Duterte was the first president in the Philippines who was not from one of the big landowning families who could trace their lineage back to Spanish colonialism in collaboration with Spanish colonialism. And he was the mayor in Davao City, in the island of Mindanao, which is the biggest island in the Philippines, before he became the president. And he was infamous as the mayor for his death squads and killing people and he was the biggest drug dealer in Mindanao. And his son, in particular, handled the drug trade, the import aspects of it. And in the Philippines, one of the big drugs is shabu, as it's called, or meth. And his son, they got the meth from China, actually. And it was very famous. Duterte's son was testifying before the Filipino Congress in one of the liberal parties, who are total hypocrites and terrible politically. They were like, can you take off your shirt? Because we all know you have a big Chinese triad tattoo on your back. And he wouldn't do it. He started to get very angry. Yeah. Now, look, it's a very sad and dark irony that this is happening, because China was the really first model the imperialists developed, even before they were imperialists, when they were just still the European colonial powers and hadn't developed into modern capitalist imperialists. There was empires at that period, but they weren't capitalist imperialist powers. And exactly what that means requires reading some Lenin. I won't get into all that now. So I'm kind of, sorry, opening up a door, then closing it and saying, forget about that. So that's not a great way to answer your question. But look, they developed this model of poisoning a population to subdue them with the opium trade in China. I mean, literally, the Qing dynasty was like, had this commodity. The Brits wanted it, tea, in huge numbers. They would only accept silver. The Brits were like, fuck, we're draining our silver reserves. What do? Open the fucking country up with guns and force them to buy our opium. And they flooded the Qing dynasty with opium. They had two big opium wars. The Brits, the Germans, the Americans, the Japanese didn't fight in the wars, but they got involved in trade afterwards, Japanese. And a huge number of American business people got rich off this. And China was like the model of that. By the time the revolution happened in Shanghai, 1949, literally half the population in Shanghai was on opium in one form or another, or heroin. There's a great book about this. What is it? Like the imperialism and the poppy field. I'm forgetting the name. We can send it out to people afterwards, or everyone who signed up for the event. But it's like basically just a tracking of this. Like people know, for example, about the coup to install the Shah of Iran happened in part because of the nationalization of the oil industry. It also happened because with the government that was elected in Iran before the Shah, the coup set him up, they banned the cultivation of poppy. And Iran was part of what was called the Golden Crescent of Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, where they do all the poppy production for the CIA's global heroin trade. And the CIA wants their heroin. That's how they make their money. But yeah, China's beginning to do this, is the short answer. The full extent of it isn't yet known, but we know some elements of it. And it's a very sad and dark irony that the Chinese ruling class is taking this up after China was subjugated by this very method. In part, this wasn't the only method, but it was a huge part of it. Okay, we'll take 3 more. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How real do you think these threats are to use more force in the Arctic and against the Europeans and the Canadians? And does this really threaten pushing of the army?
The EU will not fight the US for Greenland. 0% chance. The EU has been brought to its knees, not by Russia, but by the United States. With the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, the European industry has been decimated. US tariffs and other measures have basically increasingly forced the EU to accept that they will not ever, as a bloc, constitute a great power. There was a plan that Mario Draghi, the former head of the ECB, developed a couple of years ago. It was a comprehensive plan. He was part of a commission set up by the European Commission, or a standing working group, whatever, to develop European strategic autonomy. And Macron was going on about this at the time and so on. It involved the investment of 600 billion euros a year from European private industry to ensure that Europe would not be dependent on China or the US and that its products could compete on a global scale. For example, for those who don't know, German products have been able to compete on a global scale with US products and Chinese products because of a fairly specialized sector in the German industry called the Mittelstand, which is like a bunch of highly technically skilled, small-scale industry where workers make key parts and things are highly automated. It's very efficient. Their supply lines are set up well. This is all going under because of the cost of electricity, which is 3 times right now in Europe what it is in China and the US. It's just they can't compete in the global scale, their products, which means their status declines, which means others eat up their pie because imperialist competition is a zero-sum game. So to try to fight the US for Greenland, I mean, first, they couldn't commit many troops to it, but even if they did, what did the US say? Okay, no more natural gas. You're done. No more US dollar swap lines, et cetera, et cetera. They have a very small amount of leverage and wiggle room, but very little. Now, to speak more about Trump's maximalist demands, which is what he does. He puts out these maximalist statements. He generally always uses that as initial bargaining position and then backs down and then claims it was all part of the deal. The US, when Trump first floated Greenland coming to the US, maybe even a swap with Puerto Rico going to Denmark, which is absurd on so many levels. The liberals were mad because they're like, no, Puerto Rico, like what? Why do you want Greenland? But it's more absurd because Puerto Rico is a fucking colony of the US and the US ruling class has no right to say anything about what happens to Puerto Rico. But people thought it was crazy and the liberals fixated on it for the wrong reason. It wasn't crazy. It was a move by Trump because with the melt in the Arctic is essential for the trade now. It just is. It's one of the most important trade routes in the world because you no longer need to go through the Suez Canal. You no longer need to go through the Straits of Malacca. And these are called strategic lanes of communication. That's what they're called in US military jargon. And the maintenance of these choke points is key for controlling global trade and is key in the preparation for any world war. Because since World War II, with the development in the Soviet Union of novel forms of warfighting, involves actually the entire supply chain and not just the troops. And so what you have is extreme concern amongst the US about the Arctic. The US has very few icebreakers. I think they have 2. Russia has like 100 ships to go through the Arctic and break the ice. The US has very little skill in deep water drilling or setting up and navigating, not deep water drilling, under ice drilling in the Arctic and setting up and navigating through the Arctic. And the US wants to massively expand its military presence in the Arctic. There's also some concerns about what Trump's calling the Golden Dome and setting up stuff in Greenland. It's unclear to me if the Golden Dome is just like Star Wars. I don't mean the movie. I mean the thing Reagan talked about. The Reagan administration went on and on as part of a PSYOP about Star Wars, this system of lasers to shoot missiles out of space. And the US was developing directed energy weapons in that period, but they knew they'd be nowhere near ready to stop an intercontinental ballistic missile. What they did was they claimed they would as an effort to try to get the Soviets to freak out about it. So the Golden Dome thing may be somewhat similar. But regardless, Greenland is very essential. Now, in terms of Canada, my prediction is that the US will get significantly greater influence in Greenland in one way or another. Maybe it'll be the 51st state. Maybe it will just be like kind of passed into US control in some way. But Denmark won't be functionally running Greenland. In terms of Canada, what's really going on here? Why did India join the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Does anyone know? The US asked them to, secretly. The US wanted India to go into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that China set up as a spoilsport. There's some theories that the Brits partially went into the EU for similar reasons, actually. I don't know if that's true or not. But in terms of this maneuvers with Canada and Carney's speech and stuff, it's interesting. But he's, been a part of like the, banking elite basically for a very long time. This guy's not a radical. His speech at Davos was very, very out of character. I don't think he suddenly grew like a real Canadian populist bone and is like, yeah. But the Canadian bourgeoisie are chafing a little bit under the US. They will, I think, be forced to acquiesce. They have very little leverage. They're trying to get some leverage. My guess is this was a negotiating position to basically say, well, we could do all this trade with China. Then Trump gets really mad and they say, okay, well, we'll cut a deal with you, Trump. And they make it seem like they're giving big concessions, but actually bigger concessions would have been on the table otherwise. That's speculation, but they're not about to like massively start importing Chinese EVs and then flood the US market with them like some people are saying. There's just no way Canada has that level of power or leverage. And there was an interesting article in Politico, and it basically said, like, look, middle powers like Canada and all of Europe just need to accept their middle powers. They're not great powers, and they never will be. I forget the author, but it's decent analysis actually of their limits. And if they have illusions of otherwise, they'll pay a big price for them. You're next. Mm. Mm. Yeah. 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 The question was, how do I see the situation with Cuba and what's going on there now? And there's a lot, I'll kind of try to respond to all the sub questions you raised, but just to keep it concise. So, yeah, I mean, the first thing with the U.S. policy towards Cuba, it's consistent actually with longstanding U.S. policy towards countries that have a revolution. Never forgive. I mean, look at how Haiti's treated. The Haitian Revolution happened a few hundred years ago, and the imperialists still haven't forgiven the Haitian people for that. So I think the revolution that did happen in Cuba was a genuine anti-imperialist revolution. I mean, they kicked out the Batista government, and then immediately they were looking for compromises. Actually, Castro came to the U.S., said he wasn't really a Marxist, and was like, we want to have U.S. money come back in. And the U.S. was like, we will only accept total control like we had before. And then they weren't going to do that. But what happened is that, and there was some debate about this in Cuba, partially between Castro and Che, but also more broadly, they decided not to in any way diversify their economy. And they continued to produce, in an agreement they signed with the Soviet Union, monocrops of sugar. They didn't try to develop socialism in any meaningful sense. They gave a few popular forms, but you cannot be a socialist country and have neo-colonial relations where you grow agricultural products, sell them to a great power, and buy at extremely overpriced rates their finished goods back from you. And that was the thing that they signed up for in Cuba, the leadership. And they took on the worst aspects of Soviet political economy at that time, running everything for a profit, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of, Che had his own shortcomings, I think politically, significant ones, but that's part of why he left eventually. His disagreements over these things. And it's worth reading those debates. Now, that said, Cuba is oppressed by the US. What they've tried to do in Cuba is open the country up after the fall of the Soviet Union to a huge amount of foreign investment. So they set up special economic zones in Cuba to say foreign companies, come on in. European companies, American companies, Chinese companies. Europe went in big, Chinese companies went in big. You know, freedom to do what they want, their businesses. But that's not been enough. And the US reimposition of the embargo has drastically hurt the Cuban economy. And it's entirely possible, although in America, we're trained to think, or in the US, I should say, there's just black and white, just Satan and the devil, right? These things, multiple choice, A or B, or maybe C or D, but we're not trained to think dialectically. So the fact that and I'm not saying you're saying this, your question revealed to the contrary that you're thinking about it differently, but a lot of people basically say, if you have any criticisms of the policy in Cuba or the government or anything, you're just supporting the CIA stuff, which is honestly like insultingly stupid position. It's like, holy shit. So you can't criticize something and say that actually has a lot of flaws and oppose the people who want to destroy that and like plunder the country. I certainly think that's possible. Now, in particular in the Trump administration, you have Marco Rubio. Where was Marco Rubio in 1985? He was in Kendall, Florida, a suburban part of Miami, and he was hanging out with his uncle. His brother-in-law. I'm wrong. Who was second in command of and Marco was 15 or 17, but his uncle was second in command of the biggest cocaine trafficking ring in Miami. And he lived in his uncle's place in the spare bedroom where his uncle his brother-in-law, I keep saying uncle, stored the cocaine. And after he moved out, he came back every week to wash his uncle's 7 exotic dogs. And you might think, like, 15, 17 is a little too young to be involved in the coke trade. That's maybe true, except that particular cocaine cartel generally used 15-year-olds to carry out their assassinations. They were infamous for it. And then, the people go to his relatives, Orlando Cecilia is his relative's name, goes to prison. He gets out very early, and now he's back to running his exotic animal business, which was the front he ran for. I guess his wife's technically running it, but that was the front he ran for cocaine importation. I don't know if he's involved in coke anymore, but my point is, like, Marco Rubio comes from a section of Cuban expats in the Miami area who were linked up to the drug trade very extensively, who have basically been longing their whole life to get back to their supposed lost paradise of the Batista regime's rule in Cuba. And they are very vehement about doing so now. They think they need to do it before Trump leaves office. And fucking liberals like Bill Maher are lining up behind this. I don't know if you saw this, but Bill Maher said the other day, well, if Trump does regime change in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, yeah, we should give him the Peace Prize. Which is absurd. The question of the future for Cuba concerns, we as people in the US should support progressive forces there and so on, but it's a question for the Cuban people. My anticipation is the US will make a move on Cuba within the next year, based on the crisis that exists there, which is partially a crisis imposed by imperialism. But you have to remember that tiny little Albania, after the Soviet Union turned revisionist, Albania said, we're not turning revisionist with you. Tiny little Albania, mountainous country with 3 million people at the time. They were able to chart, based on some relative self-reliance in the 70s, an independent path forward. And they were able to subsist under blockade and economic aggression of all sorts. So it is possible as a small and poor and oppressed country, after you have a revolution, to build a self-sufficient economy, because the imperialists are going to sanction you. They're going to try to diplomatically isolate you. We know that from history. And they never pursued that path in Cuba, the leadership. They didn't want to pursue that path. They didn't want a thoroughgoing social revolution. And I'll just end with one important quote from Robert F. Williams, who wrote famously, he was a member of the NAACP, and then he was too radical for them in the 60s, so he was basically partially kicked out. He wrote a book, Negroes with Guns, and his argument was, we need armed black self-defense. It very much influenced the Panthers. He had to flee the US. He went to Cuba after the Cuban Revolution and was there for a little bit, and he was so disillusioned with what he saw. He said, in Cuba, the white petty bourgeoisie is in power. Castro said, look, you don't have to we're not going to desegregate. Don't worry, white Cubans, we're not going to desegregate. It was some pretty disgusting stuff, honestly, in terms of not being willing to carry the revolution forward, even though it was a real genuine revolution. And so what did Robert Williams do? He went to China, to revolutionary China. And he said, look, this, I think, is an example of what's really a revolutionary country. And he was a big influence on groups like the Panthers, who really then looked to revolutionary China as an example of what a revolution was in contrast to Cuba. And that's why if you watch the film, The Assassination of Fred Hampton, which is a fantastic film about the killing of Fred Hampton by the US government, you'll see about 30 minutes in, Fred Hampton's talking to some other black radicals who are basically trying to get a credit union starting and build a little bank. He's like, look, he doesn't agree with that whole approach of like buy black, bank black. He's saying we need revolution, not like more black capitalists. But he says to them, look, you can't say right now whether Castro is really a revolutionary, because what you do after the revolution, that's what really determines it. And he says, that's why in the Black Panther Party, we look to China, because what they've done in China is to continue the revolution after the revolution. And I think that's really the inspiration we should draw, and also where our criticism should be oriented in terms of Cuba. Like, they didn't continue the revolution afterwards, and unfortunately, this is the situation you end up in, inevitably, if you don't. Okay, there was one more question. Who's the next question?
So, based on the developments that are happening in this hemisphere, like agriculture, and I think you can also extend this out, like what's called the brink.
Sorry, in terms of what?
Like, in terms of like chickens coming home from
Yeah.
the house and everything, people. And then just a quick follow-up after that. What limitations would be like, do you think, what limitations do you think would be overcome
Mm.
for a population to take root within the United States? Or rather, what conditions would take place for that to happen?
Okay, so I'll do the first one, then I'll do the second one. So the first one was like, how does all this great power competition impact people here, and chickens coming home to roost, imperial boomerang, etc. Just to paraphrase roughly. I mean, obviously the simplest thing with the imperial boomerang is the ICE agents, right? I mean, we're seeing them dressed up in tactical gear, using surplus military equipment, using the surveillance technologies that were pioneered on Palestinians and elsewhere on the US population, killing people, etc. But more broadly, just zoom out from that. What we see with this level of great power competition and with the US in fairly rapid decline is the plummeting of standards of living here, and in particular, the massive devaluation of the dollar, which has a lot of consequences. So there's a few points to be made in political economy that I can't really get into here. But in effect, while the dollar officially was decoupled from gold, from a Marxist perspective, gold remains the real ultimate source of the value, the physical embodiment of labor by, okay, I'm actually going to not go down this road too much because I'm going to get too much into political economy, and even the first 3 chapters of Capital are a lot. In effect, the best way to look at US inflation is not the official numbers. They're a lie. They have been for a while. You can go to this website, shadowstats.com, or maybe it's .org. And there's a guy, he's like basically a bourgeois economist, but he just uses the old methodology before Reagan to track US inflation, and it's way higher than they say it is. But the best way is just look at US prices in gold. Like, how much gold does a Big Mac cost? And examine that. And what you see is that, first, inflation is a lot higher than it is. But second, in the lead up to every major crisis the US faces, you have a massive disorientation of the price system, and in particular, the skyrocketing dollar price of gold. Because, as Marx puts it, the value of a currency, the price of a currency, is its stability. Actually, sorry, he says it's stability, not the value, is determined not only by the technical factors, velocity of money, amount of currency in circulation, etc., but also by the general intentions of commodity owners and the trust they place in the authority that issues that currency. So what's happening now? The authority that issues the currency, the US, and especially the Federal Reserve itself, there's collapsing trust in that institution by members of the bourgeoisie themselves. Now, they want to, the US capitalists, they want to support it, but you want to be the idiot supporting it while everyone else is dumping their dollar holdings? No. What's more, through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is generally misunderstood as a Chinese infrastructure project, China has since 2013 stopped purchasing treasuries, US government debt, with their trade surplus, the dollars they get from their trade surplus with the US, and instead invested their US dollar surplus into structural adjustment programs in oppressed countries to reconfigure those countries to suit the needs of Chinese imperialism. So in many countries right now, China, and not US-based banks, are the biggest lender of US dollars to those countries. At the same time, and Xi just announced this yesterday, China is working to increasingly internationalize their own currency. As global demand for the dollar falls, because people are pivoting out of dollar assets and into gold, and also because other currencies are becoming more prominent, and also because countries are looking to do what they basically call counter trade, which is like basically reducing their overall net reliance on the dollar by looking at their country's respective trades and kind of balancing it out to reduce the amount of net dollar or gross dollar transactions they do. Demand for the dollar falls rapidly. First slowly, then quickly. That's how things, they say first things go to hell, slowly, then rapidly and all at once, then in a straight line, right? I'm misremembering the statement, but it's saying it doesn't matter. The better bourgeois analysts are calling this the rolling poly crisis that the US is facing and has been embroiled in really since maybe 2014 or maybe 2016. 2014 being the coup the U.S. Sponsored in Ukraine and the subsequent issues with Russia. What we will see in the not so distant future is some real economic drawdown in the U.S. Now, what often happens in crises, global economic crises, is that they start somewhere else. Where did the dot-com crisis start? Actually in Asia with the so-called like Asian tigers. And capital flowed out of those countries and into the US, into the relative safety of the US market. It further overheated the dot-com bubble, and then a few years later, it crashed here. And so while Europe's been mired in stagnation since the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, the US stock market's been levitating. But generally, the peak is signaled by the rise in commodity prices and gold in particular. And that partially has to do with cyclical factors in what Marx called the decennial, the every 10-year crisis cycle of capitalism. But it partially has to do with the approach the US is taking, the increasingly bellicose and unilateral approach, which is undermining the confidence of international investors. The best way we can understand this is to return to the previous crisis in the US-led international order, namely the crisis that was precipitated at the end of the Bretton Woods system, which ultimately culminated in Nixon closing the gold window in '71. This crisis was not actually principally a crisis between the US and an enemy. It wasn't a crisis between the US and the Soviet Union. There was a general fear of the US's role to play the world policeman, that it was losing that ability as it was getting bogged down a little bit in Vietnam and so on. But actually, the main crisis began as a conflict between rival imperialist powers, namely France and Britain and others who were members of the Bretton Woods systems, but felt that the division of the world that had been established in the wake of World War II was unfair. They had grown in their relative power and size compared to the US. They'd been, after all, devastated by the war. The US hadn't been, and so on. But by the late 60s or mid 60s, they were like, hey, we're not getting a big enough piece of the pie of the plunder. We want more. And they were very worried. The US was running big budget deficits for Lyndon Johnson's like Great Society welfare programs and also for the Vietnam War. And they're looking at this like, we've got all of our fucking gold in the US and they're telling us it's $35 an ounce. And we're holding on to these dollars. We don't trust this. So they cashed out their gold. And this precipitated the crisis where basically the US went off the gold standard. We're in effect facing a similar level of crisis here. What happened after the US went off the gold standard? You had the 1970s in the US, which was historically known as a period of stagflation, which means basically no economic growth and big inflation. And there was massive nominal dollar inflation. But if you look at the gold prices of goods in the US, that period was a classical depression. No economic growth and deflation. Things in gold prices got cheaper. They just printed a bunch of dollars to kind of make it look like there was inflation. We're likely going to head into a similar period in the US, especially because this buildup with reshoring is going to lead to a massive glut, an overproduction of a bunch of some goods they don't really need and they can't sell. It's exactly what happened after the Roaring '20s. They had all this new industry they built after World War I, and then, oh shit, we built way too much industry because we're taking all these loans, expecting future profits. We can't realize it. A bunch of things go out of business. And that's when you had the Great Depression. I'm not saying we're going to have another Great Depression, but I do think in the next few years, an economic crisis, which we're due for around 2019 if we have kept the 10-year cycle roughly, which never quite keeps that, will be probably as severe as what we saw in the stagflationary 70s, which was quite severe. Okay, and then remind me of the second part of your question. So the question was, what conditions need to take shape for there to be more popular and working class movements? There's a few different things. I think, first of all, we're seeing some important things right now, actually, with the resistance to ICE. I mean, the protests have a number of different issues, but there's mass mobilization against ICE. One of the big threats there is the ability of the bourgeoisie to corral this into the Democratic Party and their affiliated NGOs, and even some left orgs that basically act as appendages of the Democrats. And if that happens, which is what happened with George Floyd, it happened at a different pace in different cities, we'll see a very quick drawdown. And, we'll get some weird like DEI level reforms and that'll amount to basically nothing. I mean, think about it. Like the biggest protest movement in US history was George Floyd by numbers. And we didn't even get cuts in the fucking police budget because of how subjectively weak. They were objectively strong, a lot of people, but subjectively, I don't mean people being arbitrary. I mean like people's clarity ideologically on the nature of the capitalists. We were fooled by one grifting politician after another, by one weird like corporate DEI consultant who does like office, like inherent bias training. And a lot of the movement was fooled by that, or little like, I don't know, wreckers, some of them Fed sponsored, obviously, because the Feds always send their sponsors in to basically sow division in the popular movement. We got to be able to navigate all those complexities, co-optation efforts, unprincipled grifters, various leaders who then get co-opted, various wreckers and agent provocateurs and everything else. And we have to learn. So the success and ability to grow this movement depends on whether the advanced elements, some of which are in existing organizations and some of which are just people out there learning as they go, in these movements are able to sum up some of these lessons and understand how to navigate the complexities of the contradictions in front of us and guide to the limited degree which is possible at present the objective process that is the mass movement and navigate all the efforts of the bourgeoisie to destroy it. That said, this in and of itself is not sufficient. We have an urgent and pressing task as Marxists, which is to harness the growing militancy of the working class in this movement, which is still just recovering from historic lows. The US Department of Labor has changed how they keep strike statistics in a lot of ways, but 2017, according to their statistics, was the lowest year for strike actions in the entire history of the United States. That's measuring not just number of strikes, but total hours of people out on strike. So it gives you a sense of the size and scope of the strike movement. We're rebounding from that low. It's good we are. And it's good there were calls for a general strike in Minneapolis, but it wasn't a general strike. Look at the Seattle general strike in the start of this century. They shut down the whole city for 5 days. Workers ran the city. You could use your union card to get around. You know, this wasn't a general strike in Minneapolis. It was an important thing that the corrupt union leadership who works hand in glove with both parties, historically mostly the Democrats, now more the Republicans too for some unions, felt the pressure from below to call for a general strike while also opposing one, actually. That shows the workers are interested in this sort of militancy and using their power as workers and organizing as a class, actually, not as individuals, not as a special interest group, but as a class, something distinct from the bourgeois class. But we have a long way to go. And one of the key tasks of communists, and I mentioned this to you before, we were talking a little bit about it, is what Lenin lays out in What is to be Done, which is to say that the only way you can take the resistance of the working class, spontaneous and sometimes economic, and sometimes even more than just economic, and develop it into true class consciousness, that is consciousness of the working class interest to wage revolution and to fight to abolish class society as such, is through exposures of all the major issues of the day, but from a distinctly working class perspective. Workers need to be taught to understand the issues with like what's going on with Charlie Kirk's assassination, not from Candace Owens' perspective of like right-wing Christian populism, although she has provided some important exposures of the role of the US and Israeli military and Erica Kirk herself probably in killing Charlie Kirk. But if people are taught that from a right-wing Christian populist perspective, they're totally disoriented. Then they believe this is a fight against Satan or Satanist elites. And if they watch Democracy Now! And they see Amy Goodman hand-wringing about the undermining of the values of our democracy, I mean, she's an anti-communist to her core. And if they understand climate change through that lens, then we're fucked. You know, so the tasks of communists, we can't tail the populist right. Not many do, but there is some pressure in that regard now that the populist right is offering real critiques of things like the Epstein stuff and other stuff, and critiques that a lot of liberals and leftists aren't making very well. We can't tail the liberal left. We have to teach workers, because those are actually both forms of bourgeois politics. They ultimately don't question the sanctity of private property. They ultimately don't question the division of mental and manual labor. They don't question ultimately the division of town and countryside. And they don't question ultimately the division of industry and agriculture, the four great contradictions that define class society. And for those who don't know, class society is a relatively new phenomenon in human history. It arose 8,000 years ago. That's a fairly small percentage of human history that's existed. It's a historical phenomena which came into being and which can pass out of being. Doesn't mean we just live in a utopia. There's lots of other problems to solve then. But those specific contradictions can be overcome. And we have to teach workers to understand the issues of the day, the key issues of the day, from a perspective that has that general historical framework. And not that of, middle-class suburban life in America as the end goal for human history, which is pretty fucking bleak. I mean, just watch a David Lynch film to know how dark that shit is. But yeah, that's a fantastic question. We'll do a few more questions and we'll probably wrap. So I'll probably take 2 more questions, then we can wrap and people can chat. You want to do one more? I just want to see if anyone else wants to go first. All right, last question is you. Yeah. So the question was, why do I classify Amy Goodman as an anti-communist? Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez have been explicit in opposing basically all discussions of communism as authoritarian. Now, they do correctly criticize some countries that call themselves communist but are, not communist. And I mean, no countries are really communist, but organizations or parties that call themselves communist or socialist, they'll critique them for some aspects of their repressive behavior. But they basically, as a foundational principle, believe in American democracy, which is, the democracy that was set up by the merchants who profited from slavery and the slave owners. That's not a democracy in a meaningful sense, where the people, and what do we mean by democracy? Are there formal voting rights? Do we have some basic constitutional protections, although they're being eroded? Yeah, we're not living under fascism yet, but it's a bourgeois democracy. And as Marx and Engels noted, all class societies are ultimately dictatorships of one class over another. And so a bourgeois democracy, even where it has voting rights, means that really the major decisions are made behind closed doors. And we can see this very clearly with the Epstein files, how many major decisions are made in these little crazy, coked out emails Epstein's sending. But they're made in the think tanks and the policy papers. They're made in health and human services and the permanent unelected bureaucracy that runs the country. The politicians are there, but they don't really have so much power. And they're made by the class. And there's really democracy for the capitalists. They get to decide, based on the rule of $1, 1 vote, how things are run. The people don't have much say. We can't really make decisions about the basics, but we have some rights. That's different from fascism. But bourgeois democracy is not our goal. But for people like Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez, it is their goal. And hence, anytime there's some milquetoast liberal reformist who comes along, they are literally, I guess they're probably faking it on some level, unless they're really that dumb to believe this time it's different. But they're over the moon excited about these people. And then the same thing happens every time. So that's the basics. And they've also really refused on democracy now to cover actual communist movements around the world. Okay, just give you one example. At present, the government of India has deployed 900,000 troops and paramilitaries and police officers in the jungles of central India. They are waging what they're calling a final solution, Operation Kagar, against the indigenous people there, the Adivasis, who are about 110 million in number. The Adivasi movement is by and large led in that area of India by the Communist Party of India, Maoist, who's been waging various forms of struggle, but especially guerrilla war for the last 40-something years against the government. The government is using Israeli and US drones and planes to massacre people. They're carrying out all sorts of atrocities that have been documented, not just in India, not just by communists, but by human rights groups, even by the UN and stuff. And even the fucking EU Parliament has made a few statements about it. But democracy now won't touch that shit. And it's this is the Modi government, a government whose it's the BJP in India is the electoral party, but they're part of this umbrella of fascist organizations called the Rastriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, RSS. And the Rastriya Swayam Sevak Sangh was founded in the 1920s by these people who openly worshipped Hitler. And they still teach their books in the schools in India. In the RSS, they said in this book by their second supreme leader, M.S. Golwalker, he said, the Nazis shocked Europe by doing what they did to the Jews. But this is a great lesson for us to learn from and profit by. And that the RSS wants to do the same thing to Muslims in India, of which there's 230 million. So that government, it's like, even from the liberal perspective, you could talk about their outrages, even if you disagree with the communists, but they're fucking silent about this shit. And I don't think it's willful ignorance on their part. It's an ideological commitment at a minimum to not give any sort of coverage that would be favorable in any way to any communist forces. Okay, I was gonna do one more question. I saw one more hand, so we'll squeeze it in. A fantastic question. If China acts as an imperial force, why do they call themselves communists? The first thing to note is that the ruling class of any given country is not omnipotent. They're not a demiurge. They exist and are able to rule insofar as they can relatively objectively grapple with the existing social forces and guide them in a certain direction. So China was, for a time, a real socialist country and led by a real communist party. But in 1976, shortly after Mao's death, and his individual death is important because he was an important leader, but because also the right then moved quickly because there wasn't strong leaders in the left. The leading forces in the party, especially Deng Xiaoping, who had been labeled the number 2 person in the party taking the capitalist road, led a coup. This coup involved violent fighting between the military and the military militias. Between 5 and 10 million people were killed and arrested. The exact numbers aren't known. And first Hua Guofeng came to power, but Deng Xiaoping ran things behind the scenes. And then after 2 years, in 1978, Hua Guofeng was removed and Deng Xiaoping came to power. He said to get rich is glorious, but some must get rich first. They worked to systematically break up all the collective ownership of land and then ended up creating 300 million migrant laborers through doing so. They brought in huge amounts of foreign investment to develop China's industry with the aid of foreign capital. Growth rates in this period, despite it being called the growth miracle, are actually lower than in the socialist period, but this is called this amazing period of growth. It wasn't. And they carried out a counter-revolution. It was initially bloody, and then they purged huge sections of the party leadership after the initial coup. Socialism, as Lenin notes, is defined by a period where the bourgeoisie and proletariat are even more at loggerheads, and Mao's analysis was that the bourgeoisie under socialism is in the Communist Party itself. It emerges a new bourgeoisie, and this bourgeoisie won, and they restored capitalism. But they couldn't just say we've restored capitalism, because you have a country of a few 100 million people who have stood up and fought against capitalism. So they say, we're taking a new path to build socialism. We're taking a new path. We're doing a birdcage model, initially, they said, where capitalism is the bird and the cage, the socialist state. And then Deng Xiaoping was like, this is too much. Like, we need to actually cut way more. We need way more private industry. We need to cut all the union benefits for the unionized workers. Like, this is just too much. And then people were starting to rebel. So the Tiananmen stuff happened, and there was some involvement of US spies and stuff there, but it was really a real domestic movement in China against the cutting of a lot of the benefits of the union workers and the shift towards more private industry, amongst other things. And after Tiananmen, Deng does his southern tour, and basically they get rid of the birdcage model. And it's like full-blown, capitalist special economic zones, the creation of the Pearl River Delta city, mega city, 60 million people in those 3 cities. But they still call themselves communist. It's domestically important and advantageous, and it's ideologically important globally. They can pretend they're an alternative to some degree for the US. This is the nature of social imperialism, which was analyzed by Mao and the Chinese Communist Party when they criticized the restoration of capitalism in the USSR. They said the leadership of the USSR after Stalin, and there's some argument maybe even before, partially under Stalin, although whether he was consciously supporting that or not is a separate question. They're socialist in name, but imperialist and capitalist in deeds. And this analysis and what was called the Great Debate in the international communist movement and the critiques the Chinese Communist Party under Mao's leadership put forward in the 60s to criticize the Soviet Union are very important to understanding the characteristics of the Chinese state today. But the need to maintain the idea that they are socialist, and actually they've crafted an entire ideology to justify this. And they make their pleas for national unity, social stability, but for fighting the US, all in terms of very milquetoast and devoid of much Marxist content, but pleas around communism. They even have shows like Marx Was Right, which teaches you very little about Marx, but it's like a big TV show to talk about how Marxism is correct. But what sort of Marxism are they talking about? And you can read, for example, the pretty open distortions of Marxism. There was many critiques of this that the Soviet Union put forward, where they still called themselves Marxists. But let's ask a question closer to home. Why did Zoran, although he backed off it, call himself a socialist? Was he advocating for socialism? No. But damn, was it effective to making sure that he got elected and that a lot of the DSA supported him and that now people aren't protesting quite as much. And we'll see, hopefully that changes now that his mom's in the Epstein files and he's still supporting Tish and, he's supporting, like he literally backed the cops that shot the kid the other day. We'll see. But the bourgeoisie is not stupid. They understand the names don't always correspond to things. All right, so thank you all. We'll break up now. We don't have to leave right away, so we can chat, hang out, talk. Thank you all for coming.